We're going to begin the conversation with sort of a struggle that Alex and I had last night when we were trying to write the intro to the conference. So we had a long discussion about how to introduce this complex topic. Do we begin by defining codes and protocols? Do we address their impact on the built environment and our daily practice? Should we talk about their potentialities and limitations? Or maybe we should start by asking how to decode them, unsettle and unbuild them. Where do we begin?
So eventually start by asking, why does the topic still need attention? Why should we still talk about codes? Why still bother to spend time on such an ordinary and, for many, boring subject? We turn to an observation voiced by Aaron Ben Joseph, who said, just as genes are obscure, difficult to trace, and often misunderstood as to their impact on bioorganisms, so too are the influence of design standards and their impact on the built environment opaque. The incremental nature of standards reduces each requirement to a singular, discrete mandate. As such, the influence of each standard may seem relatively minor by comparison to the wealth of other variables that are part of the process of urban planning and development. However, when viewed in their totality, their cumulative force has a tremendous effect on the design of places that thus far has been unnoticed. And this is why we think that we still need to talk about standards, codes, and protocols again, and again. Standards, codes, and protocols underlie most forms of power. Power is maintained through a discrete and hidden agency of codes. Perhaps then, it's not a bad idea to start by simply going back to ideas of power and its impact on human freedom, and for this we return to Foucault. For Foucault, one of the meanings of human existence, the source of human freedom, is never to accept anything as definitive, untouchable, obvious, or immobile. No aspect of reality should be allowed to become a definitive and inhuman law for us. We have to rise up against all forms of power, but not just power in the narrow sense of the word, referring to the power of a government or of a social group over another. These are only a few particular instances of power. Power is anything that tends to render immobile and untouchable those things that are offered to us as real, as true, as good. According to Foucault, the key to revealing the precise location and questioning various manifestations of power is to consider all the points of fixity, of immobilization, as elements in a tactics or in a strategy, as part of an effort to bring things back into their original mobility, their openness to change.
Georgia Agamben reiterates the Foucauldian apparatus as literally anything that has in some way the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, or secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. Then apparatuses not only prisons, madhouses, the panopticon, schools, confession, factories, disciplines, and juridical measures, but also the pen, writing, literature, philosophy, agriculture, cigarettes, navigation, computers, cellular telephones, and why not language itself? Language, the most ordinary medium for describing environments we inhabit, or better yet, for constructing them. For Claude Raffestein, the contemporary geographer, the discovery and interpretation of our world depends on mediators, whether being our sensory organs or instruments and cultural tools created by people. Mediators play an extremely important role in territoriality as they are tools of apprehension of and relation with the environment. If codes and protocols are to be understood as mediators between us and our environment, they cannot be disassociated from territoriality. Territoriality in a synthetic sense, simultaneously as a system of relations with material and immaterial realities, and as a system of representation of these realities. Representation in this particular context and for the purpose of our conference includes all processes of differentiation, categorization, and standardization, which then establishes regulatory systems and take command of imagination. Understanding how we live within these systems can help us better understand how these mediators incrementally and unnoticeably work us over, how they build and unbuild territories, whether through organizing a space or conditioning the everyday social and cultural behavior or other means. For instance, we recognize after aggregate that citizenship and social standing have been intimately bound up with the forms of self-regulation built into norms of home shaped and contested by government policies, by the markets in credit, insurance, and other services, as well as by the shelter press and other cultural media. So how do we position our field and our specific expertise in this context? How do we decode the spaces we inhabit and behaviors we share? First as humans, and then as designers, planners, creative thinkers, and researchers.
So we go back to Foucault. We adopt three lenses, three elements that he actually uses to define his morals. And they are, first, the refusal to accept as self-evident the things that are proposed to us. Second, the need to analyze and to know, since we can accomplish nothing without reflection and understanding. Thus, the principle of curiosity. And third, the principle of innovation, to seek out in our reflection those things that have never been thought or imagined. Thus, refusal, curiosity, innovation. Let's then begin with refusal. Again, following aggregate, the group, recognizing that modernization has not been the ironclad product of authorial intention or historical inevitability, or totalizing theories of modernism, but the contingent consequence of entangled agencies, we recognize that the future too is not ironbound, but rather like the past, open to accident, manipulation, and reconfiguration. Not unlike the past generations who witnessed how ideas about safety and health, efficiency and comfort, beauty and blight crystallized into unnoticeable standards, today, at the time of this conference, we follow our curiosity to witness how certain notions of sustainability are settling down below the surface in form of generic green standards and technological incentives, replacing material and spatial solutions based on local knowledge.
Simultaneously, we observe a massive geographic shift caused by migrating frontiers of global economy, violence associated with altering geopolitics, the evolving ecological conditions driven by climate change. It appears that the new organizational logic and protocols are crystallizing at the intersection of these new geographies with the new breeds of intelligence, knowledge infrastructures, and new forms of statehood. It seems that the effectiveness of any regulatory system is contingent upon the capacity to embrace uncertainty and strategic anticipation rather than strategic planning. Better be evaluated based on ability to address specific necessities as they unfold in time by employing devices available to a particular culture in a particular place. Any regulation has to simultaneously account for expansions and subtractions, buildings and unbuildings, growth and decay. The field of design with capital D may still be navigating with a slow drift between fixed, generic, and prescriptive codes on one hand, and a specific context undergoing rapid transformations on the other hand. While other domains such as market warfare or entertainment, to name a few, have been adopting to new modalities of governance or even testing driving, forcing them. Immediacy, uncertainty, and flexibility have been discussed by designers and planners for many decades with little effect, perhaps. What is it that stops our field from being more responsive and agile? In this conference, we're hoping to reopen this decade-old and periodically reoccurring discussion by asking what protocols are taken into consideration in the process of establishment of places, communities, geographies, and statehoods. How should the regulatory boundaries be set? Whose values are taken into account and at the expense of whose risk? How is it decided what is normal from abnormal, formal from informal? So how do we innovate in this field? How can we build flexibility into solid buildings, and how do we unsettle settled territories without dismissing the potentialities that lie in continuity and some degree of permanence? How do we create a space for multiplicity of opinions and desires for human and non-human forms of intelligence? Thank you.
So before we begin the first session, we would like to thank Professor Martin Bechtold, who is the director of our program, Liz, Jen, and Ala from the ASP office and the finance office, and our friends Julia and Mariano, who are here for their support. We thank all of our sponsors who have trusted us and dedicated funds to this event, and we have received sponsorship from the ASP program and the director's office, from the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University, from Harvard University Center for the Environment, the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities, the GSD Master in Design Studies program, specifically the Urbanism Landscape Ecology concentration, from ACOM Americas, and Harvard Asia Center. We would like to thank all our guests for being here and all of you for being here. And last but not least, we thank Carles Muro and Pierre Belanger for agreeing to moderate this event and for sharing all their advice with us during its preparation. So let's start decoding. Pierre Belanger will introduce our morning guests and moderate the discussion. Pierre is Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture and Co-Director of the AMDES Postgraduate Design Research Program here at GSD. He teaches and coordinates graduate courses on the convergence of ecology, infrastructure, media, and urbanism. After the lunch break, Carles Muro will introduce the afternoon speakers and moderate the discussion. Carles is a design critic in architecture and urban design here at GSD, and he is also an accomplished practicing architect. The two sessions will be followed by the keynote lecture by Professor Stephen Moore. So please welcome Pierre Belanger and our morning speakers.
So thanks very much, Alex Ghazal, for the invitation, specifically also organizing what I consider to be probably some of the most pressing and also at the same time most experimental types of gatherings that we have here at the Graduate School of Design. Usually doctoral students are at the forefront of some of the questions that remain unanswered. So in my conversations and exchanges with Ghazal and Alex has been particularly important to try to identify ways to be able to not so much frame, but maybe set the stage for the morning panel itself. So there's a few words I'd like to just share, just to be able to a certain extent, to ground an understanding of both the presentations we'll see, but to a certain extent to try to understand also how to contextualize it within current discourse. And I assure you that we're not subliminally trying to smuggle Foucauldian thought here. It's just by complete accident and coincidence that my opening quote is an exchange between Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari that was organized under a number of conversations by Michel Foucault between 1960s and 1980s. In order to be able to place decoded fluxes of work, of production, fluxes of women, fluxes of children, a number of equipments have to be installed for the pre-formation of these fluxes. These conceptions allows one to take a course which opposes the present approach to collective equipment, and that specifically in relationship to the idea of state infrastructure, which usually precedes fundamental categories, such as the function of the Athens Charter. And we can just remind that the Athenian oath, which granted ideas or ideologies of living, circulating, recreating, working simply as natural categories, as rights to the city itself, which I'll address the notion of the city. One could consider three types of structure and structures. Collective equipment of the state has to respond to more than just compensating for the exclusions associated with these categories. Guattari finishes off by saying that there's no such thing as equipment or the idea of one centralized form of equipment. There is a constellation of equipment. Just as in itself, there's no such thing as a city as opposed to a constellation of cities. To this, Deleuze instigated, we should consider three types of structures: structures of investment, structures of public service, structures of assistance or pseudo-assistance. The reason why I bring this up is that there's a quote that is somewhat of an instigation catalyst at the beginning of the description of the conference itself. Paul Edwards, the media theorist, and you could also say climate historian, to understand an infrastructure, you have to invert it. You have to turn it upside down and look at the bottom, the parts you don't normally think about precisely because they have become standard, routine, transparent, and invisible. These disappearing elements are only figuratively below the surface, of course. In fact, they are the surface. What's interesting as part of the work that Paul Edwards presents, and kind of buried in between the lines, is also ethnographer and media theorist, the work of ethnographer Susan Leigh Starr, who unfortunately died a few years ago, extremely influential as an ethnographer of infrastructure, who wrote this book with Jeff Boker, Sorting Things Out, Classification and Its Consequences, which I think specifically addresses the question of categories that underlie notions of coding or encoding. And they say this, which in many respects also takes from the somewhat subversive, deviant work of sociologist Howard Becker in his book Art Worlds from 1982. Infrastructural inversion is a struggle against the tendency of infrastructure to disappear, except when breaking down. It means learning to look closely at technologies and at arrangements that by design and by habit tend to fade into the woodwork. I think that's particularly important because in many respects, when we speak about both coding and city, there's a number of different assumptions which I think are particularly important to sort of watch for. And to a certain extent, these watchwords are particularly important in relationship to both the guests that we have here today and also at the same time, maybe some new questions that arise. A book just recently released by Anne Michelet and Moritz Perkhauer, Urban Code, 100 Lessons for the City, is interesting because it proposes three things. The idea of an urban code directly translated to the city, also a syntax, and also it raises the question, a scale, I think. We could start to begin to ask, in direct relationship, building code, was the building code invented for the safety and security of the city or the state, or was the city or the state invented to secure the code of construction and a code of conduct? Also, they raise the issue of the question of the scene and syntax, the script as well. Is it raised in order to question determinacy and determination, i.e. the predictability of movements that becomes grounds for invoking systems of syntax, or is it to fully engage and understand matters of uncertainty and engaging contingency? After all, there was no code for understanding how to predict 9/11 and the attack on the Twin Towers, nor is there any syntax or insurgency except perhaps in the strategy of improvisation, which is usually invoked as the strategy in the war against planning. Finally, the question of scale in the book raises the issue of the state. What I mean by that is the greater hierarchy, and the higher up along the echelons of control, the more invisible the code becomes. And possibly more importantly, the more invisible the power. And so there's this relationship between code and power, which I think is particularly important to address as part of this conversation. So in many ways, this pledge of allegiance to the code, and then to the question of the code, whether we like it or not, also whether or not we vote with our money, with our bodies, and I would argue we don't vote with our minds, it is similar to the oath taken over 2,000 years ago that was reified by the citizens of Athens, Greece, over 2,000 years ago. It's also currently invoked, ironically, as a part of this resurgence of a discourse on cities, and also specifically, dangerously, as part of the discourse on the Anthropocene, which I'd like to bring up. I only need a couple more minutes for this. I assure you. But I think what's important, and potentially one needs to be somewhat careful and attentive to the words, we will never bring disgrace in this, our city, by an act of dishonesty or cowardice. We will fight for the ideals and sacred things of the city, both alone and with many. We will revere and obey the city's laws, and will do our best to incite a like reverence and respect in those above us who are prone to annul them or set them at naught. We will strive unceasingly to quicken the public sense of civic duty. Thus, in all these ways, we will transmit this city not only not less, but greater and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. The reason why I think it's dangerous is also these ideas are assumed and inherited and translated into a discourse on the Anthropocene, which proposes also a kind of another form of allegiance to the city. And I'd like to invoke a kind of counter-critique to this. And it's an interesting one. I'll admit I'm following someone called Erica Violet Lee. She is a Nihia blogger from Saskatchewan. She's organizer of Idle No More. And just a couple of weeks ago, she tweeted such a hot Euro-Western buzzword right now on the topic of the Anthropocene. However, I'd like to mention something potentially striking even deeper to the chord of discourses on the city and urbanization. If you look closely at her account portrait, she wears this kind of bossful motto across her t-shirt, not in the back, but on the front. Indigenous women resisting colonialism and patriarch since 1492. Of course, the day in which the cannibal Columbus set foot on American, or the Turtle Island, as some would call the Americas. So maybe this also indicates a kind of ulterior but related underlying motive, which I think is significant in this discourse on the code, because it invokes necessarily the question of territory and potentially the rise up against Eurocentrism of the idea of the Anthropocene. So I think between ideas that are sort of communicated through the city and the Anthropocene are particularly important. So in the decoding or the subjugation of the space of the city, and we don't call it mainstream, invoking flow for nothing, through decodification, deregulation, de-engineering, one opens the subject up not only of territory and the unique role of the map and the agency of mapping, but more importantly, the subject of code, conduct, and control. In other words, to study urbanization is to study power. So the question of power then and its relations, in a contemporary world, one could say, of decentralization and deterritorialization, as we are seeing worldwide with mass migration and subdivisions of labor, inevitably leads us to understand flows in a number of different ways. As Manuel Castells kind of claimed in 1996, power does not reside in institutions, not even in the state or large corporations. It's located in the networks that structure society itself. So therefore, the study of organization of that power is also the study of the state and the corporations through the equipment and their infrastructure. Now, I'm just going to bring two people into the conversation here just to also lay down this basis across a number of different fields outside of city and urbanization. In 1993, Rosalind Williams, the technological historian, counter-historian, you could say, identified more than 2 decades ago in her canonical text, Cultural Origins and Environmental Implications of Large Technological Systems, that the cultural origins and environmental implications of these systems establish a kind of ground zero for combined strategies of geographic zoning, boundary realignments, and reprogramming. And I quote here, "The outstanding feature of modern cultural landscapes is the dominance of pathways over settlements. The pathways of modern life are also corridors of power, with power being understood in both its technological and political senses." We could think of geopolitical thermodynamics here. "By channeling the circulation of people, goods, and messages, they have transformed spatial relations by establishing lines of force that are privileged over places and people left outside those lines." I'm detecting some movement here, so
I'm taking notes. I'm taking notes. I've read Rosalind's book.
She's great. And I'll invoke another person who wrote similar words, but in a completely different field, practically at the exact same time in 1993, by Sanford Quinter. "Despite the customary fashionable genuflection towards infrastructural questions and concerns today, little attention is being paid to the more radical, more disturbing reality that infrastructural demands are not only becoming exponentially more importunate today, but that these infrastructural demands are breeding and mutating in kind, not only in degree. We have no choice today but to deal with these new soft infrastructures: knowledge infrastructure, program infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, virtual infrastructure. The demand for design," and I'm going to underscore, and de-design, which I think is a direct kind of a voice and confirmation of the conference, "in our over-engineered and over-mediated world is both enormous and pervasive, yet the majority of architects still respond to it with the medieval language of the Stoic autonomous building." Thus, you could constantly ask, according to Quinter, what does this have to do with capital A architecture? Today's design world is stratified with an emerging class structure, its associated embedded conflicts and emerging new proletaria, increasingly separated from the principal means of production. So in many respects, in order to respond to this call from Quinter and Williams from the 1990s, I think the conference and this coming together in relationship to the guest this morning, not only do we need to think about the division of labor as one of the greatest forces to shape 21st century contemporary city, but also the scale and space of the flow of information itself. I don't think it's by mistake that also the highway is invoked since the 1990s, both in terms of the flow of information, the information highway, that has been persistently invoked and revoked as perhaps the last and greatest public space on the surface of the planet. I think in this relationship, it's also useful to kind of backdate also part of the thinking in the conference as part of trying to form a kind of different kind of codex. And I think the possibility of understanding the work of Cicero from literally the Roman era, and I had to invoke the Romans as part of this conversation here, as part of his codex from 50 BC, the 50 BCE, De Re Publica, in which he states in this kind of treatise, this Roman treatise on public space, politics, Maxim valet terra, that perhaps land has the greatest power. And one can evoke that perhaps the decodification has everything to do with understanding how to be able to ground patterns of urbanization in this topic that we've left completely off the table, the question of land. So in light of the presentations again, and this kind of rappel à l'ordre, or rappel à potentially désordre, called by the invisible structures of design, after all, we call it design, not just to plan and to designate, but also to mark out. Perhaps we can also propose the study of power that can be understood three types of flows of information. One, based on current events, leakages and spillages of information where entire nation states can be compromised by the leaking of information. We're invoking here Edward at Snowden, of course, and the release of military documents of missions and protocols. The second one, synchronicities and simultaneities, where the speeds of information and regimes can literally be brought down overnight through Twitter and text messaging, such as Tahrir Square in 2011, that sparked the Egyptian Revolution and, of course, the Arab Spring. We can remember #January 25. And finally, breaches, blockages, stoppages, and interferences of flows of information, which can either be interpreted as a compromise of over, for example, 22 million Social Security accounts by the Office of Personnel Management just recently, or the recent roadblock by the Sandy Bay First Nation on the Trans-Canada Highway, Federal Route Number 1, protesting the destruction of water resources in Bill C-45 by the Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, the former Prime Minister. That would be under #IdleNoMore. So finally, the invocation of the highway, either in the information highway or the interstate highway, necessarily brings not only Foucault, but I think Paul Vierlo and his dromological perspective in the study of environments through speed. I quote, "The loss of material space leads to the government of nothing but time. The whole geographic history of the distribution of land in countries would stop in favor of a single regrouping of time, power no longer being comparable to anything but a meteorology. In this precarious fiction, or you could say friction, speed would suddenly become destiny, a form of progress. In other words, a civilization in which speed would be something of a region of time where the violence of speed has become both the location and the law, the world's destiny and its destination." That's from Paul Vierlo, his book, Speed and Politics, in French 1986, and then translated in French 1977, and then translated in 1986. The guest speakers this morning, I haven't shared these words with the guest speakers this morning, so I'm not putting them on the spot to essentially respond to this, but rather actually the intention was simply to ground the subject this morning in relationship to both practices and agencies related to mapping, but also grounding the subject so that it doesn't necessarily only address the space in between the lines of code as we know it, but potentially grounding it and recategorizing it in different ways. So I'll just introduce our guest speakers, Benjamin Bratton, Bobby Pertusco, Vaijayanti Rao, and John Van Nostrand. We have 20 minutes per presentation each. We're going to take a break we'll take a short break after the two first presentations, and then we'll come back with Vijayanti and John afterwards. I'll make the two introductions for Vijayanti and John after the break. I'll just introduce briefly Benjamin and Bobby. Benjamin Bratton is a theorist whose work spans the fields of philosophy, art, and design. He's associate professor of visual arts and director of the Center for Design and Geopolitics at the University of California, San Diego. He's also a professor of digital design at the European Graduate School in Saas-Fee, Switzerland. His research is situated at the intersections of political and social theory, emerging computational media and infrastructure, and interdisciplinary design methodologies. I had an opportunity to meet him finally this fall at the first Yale conference on the built environment. We'll hear more, actually, since then. His book, Stack, The Stack, has been released on software and sovereignty, which I think we'll be hearing about later this morning, which is now published by MIT Press. So I won't go into any descriptions of that. I don't want to steal your thunder. I can borrow it. I'll just mention a few things here. Before coming to UC San Diego in 2009, Benjamin taught theory and design for a decade at SciArc, also where he's now visiting faculty, and from 03 to 08 was at the UCLA Department of Design Media Arts. Bobby Petruszko, Robert G. Bobby, he's, as some of you may know, he's assistant professor, sharing his time, splitting his time, sometimes even eroding his time between landscape architecture and the departments of urban planning here at the Graduate School of Design. His work explores contemporary technologies of measurement, simulation, visualization, and their relationship to the production of space. His work, as some of you may know, recently exhibited at COP21. His work on climate change at MoMA, SF MoMA as well, ZKM, among others, and is part of the permanent collection at the Fondation Cartier in Paris. Prior to joining the junior faculty here at the GSD, Petruszko was working as a designer with Diller Scofidio Renfro in New York, and held research positions at Parsons Institute for Information Mapping at the New School, where he also was working with Vijayanti, who's with us here this morning as well, at Columbia University, the Spatial Information Design Lab. He also has, and this background is, I think, important to all our guest speakers, so we'll bring this in. He also has a Bachelor of Music in Music Synthesis from the Berklee College of Music, Master of Science in Electrical Engineering from Villanova, as well as a Master in Architecture here at the GSD. So what we'll do is we'll start with Benjamin first. Bobby will follow, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll make formal introductions for John.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I think my remarks, not coincidentally enough, I think will follow on quite nicely from both of the introductions as well. So I hope I have a chance to grab on some of these threads and pull on them a bit further. My talk that I wanted to do today really sort of is in three parts, I suppose. The first one is to talk a bit about some of the issues of infrastructure, geopolitics, platforms, territory, and the role that what planetary scale computation has on the challenges and reformulations of these above, which is a lot of what the material in the book, The Stack, refers to. Second is to discuss some thoughts on the theme of the conference of decoding, what that might mean, how we might situate that, put that in motion in particular ways. And then lastly, to share some of the more recent design work that we've been doing, which operates at a somewhat different scale than that of the building, but absolutely within the fabric and solvent of the urban. And so that will go through our 20 minutes here as well. Oh, let me get this. Sorry, I want to show the notes, sorry. this up so I can see my notes at the same time. Okay. Okay, so planetary scale computation, takes place at different scales. It includes from energy and mineral sourcing and grids, subterranean cloud infrastructures, urban softwares and public service privatizations, massive universal addressing systems, interfaces drawn by the augmentation of the hand, of the eye, or dissolved into objects. Users both over-outlined by self-quantification and also exploded by the arrival of legions of sensors and algorithms and robots. And so instead of seeing all of these as a kind of hodgepodge of different species of computing, all spinning out on their own at different scales and tempos, we should see them instead as forming a coherent and interdependent whole, layer by layer, into something like a vast, if also incomplete, pervasive, if also irregular, software and hardware stack. The stack thesis proposes a specific model for the design of political geography tuned to this era of planetary scale computation. It works from the inside out, from technology to governing systems, so as to arrive again at these questions of sovereignty, its location, and its forms. Touch point by touch point, the city layer of the stack is perhaps where the birth pangs of computational geopolitics are felt most viscerally. The arrival of any political constitution is accompanied always by a corresponding foundational violence, and this is no less true of planetary computation and the jurisdictions of its emerging in its interfacial networks. But unlike modern political states that may have exploded into being by the breaching or establishment of specific symbolic centers, the constitutional violence of planetary computation's platform sovereignties occurs at the surface of the entire city, in and on every object, seemingly at once as ubiquitous and convergent as it is partial and partitional. Under these circumstances, what we might call geodesign focuses on the plasticity of sovereignty, not only on individual privacy, but also on the valuation of plural motion, gesture, and movement as the basis of fabricated polities. And as we'll see, one axis of innovation is between the rights and responsibilities of that urban interface gives to and demands from a user who is a formal legal citizen of its explicit jurisdiction, versus those it gives to and demands from a user who is not. We may find that in the future, the non-citizen in some ways, human or non-human, may in some ways enjoy certain advantages over the citizen, as infrastructures may not already be pre-programmed to govern that user directly as a formal subject, but merely to transact services with her. And so this parabolistic schema of distributed urban interfaces comprising a city layer in a larger accidental megastructure of the stack is not then, to be clear, another yarn of brick and mortar central states dissolving now into virtual decentralized networks. Rather, we trace a shift in what James Scott called seeing like a state means in the age of machine vision and automation, and with attention to sensate urban surfaces, what sensing like a state comes to entail. That is, borders don't so much disappear as they multiply exponentially. To that point, their granular hyperstriation only appears smooth at certain distances. In this, certain questions of sovereignty reemerge, but they do so in unusual formats. In the book, The Stack, I make considerable use, or arguably misuse, I'm happy to come to that, of Carl Schmitt's notion of the nomos, or the fundamental, for him, the fundamental linear inscription that marks occupation, this signing of the design, that gives political geography its shape, and which informs ensuing geopolitical orders in its image. The nomos is that particular subdivision of the earth into sovereign jurisdictional zones. Now, the Westphalian order subdivided land, but not water, not air, not the electromagnetic spectrum, into a looping topology of sovereign national units on a horizontal plane. Its nomos is that loop topology concretized as the geometry of the modern state order, for which sovereign supervision of any one citizen or site or event is ultimately reducible to its one law, except when it's not, as for cosmopolitan orders or the ongoing proliferation of enclaves and exclaves. Now, the nomos of the cloud is also a vertical political geography. There's much, and it does because it makes in this competition between states and platforms, there's a competition over the right to claim and adjudicate any one site, event, or person. And in doing so, there isn't a resolution of all of these claims into one sort of consensual cosmopolitan order, but an overlapping, a doubling, and a tripling of these, not as some kind of accumulating layers of exception, but as a new norm. Now, there is much to be said then about what we may call the function of the sovereign exception, continuing the invocation of Schmidt, as it relates to these nomic geographies, old and new. And so in the interest of time, I'll draw out just a couple, particularly as they relate to the city. First, the problem of nomos and sovereignty is drawn not only as a zone of exception, as it is for Agamben via Schmidt. The line itself is in a continual state of potential exception to itself. That is, it draws inside from outside, home from alien, by demarcating that boundary. But the line does not know when one side is the inside or the outside, nor does it itself normally need to. Inside and outside can oscillate, and they do. Fences keep you in as much as they keep others out, and vice versa. And as an architecture, a camp, Agamben's nomos of the modern, may be physically indistinguishable from an enclave. A machine to quarantine the excluded by partition may flip into a machine for keeping the world at bay, and may do so at any moment. And so the nomic partition is built on and for an exception that may invert itself in situ. And so in this way, we observe that the camp is not the only nomos of the modern, Agamben's claim, you recall. The enclave is as much. And we see so many of them, which is why perhaps we see so many of them in the same situation. Now, a question of what then may be a nomos of the cloud is then put forward. The sovereign geographies and geometries of planetary scale computation suggest, as I say, a layering of multiple jurisdictional claims in a thickened order of planes at the continental and at the individual scales. And also, again, towards this, as I say, a sensing like the state of the state at the scale of the urban interface. So, however, as that interface, the urban interface, may now be computationally animated in some way, in whole or in part, such that its software is a program determining how it functions as a gateway within a larger array. So in this landscape of gateway interfaces, each is programmed to decide when to open and when to close, what to admit and what to refuse. For any two users, the same interface may decide to include or to exclude them, and so their paths diverge. And in the accumulation of these interfacial gateway decisions, the city coheres itself differently for each user, and instantiates control less through blunt institutional walls and partitions containing masses than through a more liquid accumulation of binary inputs and outputs, letting free-range users roam where they please because there is no ultimate outside to which they might escape. We recognize this in Deleuze's Society of Control thesis, for example, where he speculates on a city in which the accumulation of what he calls electronic gateways, and what we call ubiquitous computing, and its urban scale interfaces, both human-facing and infrastructural, usher in this new condition. In other words, the aggregation of programmed interfaces does at a much finer scale what big dumb borders do. And so too, the surfaces of this camp enclave dynamic not only get smaller and faster with more processing power, their ability to switch from an interiorizing to an exteriorizing function, that is, the exception that is built into the exception itself, may be measured in gigaflops, billions of operations per second. Camp switches into the enclave in an instant, but may do so for any given cohort of users in intricate and overlapping meshes of provisional interior and exterior microzones. What is exit for one may be entrance for another. The sovereignty of the exception is automated. Automation, autonomos, autonomy, becomes instantiated, oscillating sovereign decision. So a word then on this question on the institutionality that was raised before, on the platform logics of the city layer. Stacks are platforms, but not all platforms are stacks. A working definition of platform, and I make an argument in the book that we need to understand, we desperately need a more comprehensive political, economic, and cultural theory of platforms. I think platforms need to be understood as both a technical and institutional system of significance comparable to that of states and markets. We get in trouble when we try to reduce platforms to what we know about those other two. A working definition of a platform might include references to a standards-based technical economic system, including and especially stack topologies, which simultaneously decentralizes interfaces through the remote protocological coordination and which centralizes their integrated control through that same coordination. Platforms are both then, as I say, a technical and institutional model. Their logics of sovereignty are not reducible to those of states and markets, but our contemporary discussion of platforms, which increasingly do the heavy lifting of global governance, are discussed as if they were. States have citizens, markets have homo economicus, but the base component political subject of the platform is the user, a very different kind of creature. Platforms work by the centralized aggregation of interactions made by the decentralized distribution of interfaces with which users interact, one because the other. Now, as far as the platform itself is concerned, user sovereignty is derived from the decisions that would instantiate into a wider interfacial program is available to anything. Anything can be a user, animal, vegetable, mineral, anything that can interact significantly with those interfaces, and in doing so initiate the entire apparatus at once. The risks and potentials of platform sovereignty are borne by a geopolitics of platforms that's still very much in formation, one that points as much to cloud feudalism as to what the British call fully automated luxury communism, as well as by the radically open subject position of the user, one available, as I say, to humans, network sensors, high-speed trading algorithms, driverless cars, swarms of animals. The interface is agnostic as to species. The platforms we are building, including the accidental infrastructure of the stack, are predicated on a functional agent-subject position that holds far less regard for the special status of human creatures in how it governs with and by sovereign exceptions of entrance and exit than we're used to. And so I think among the most violent and painful contests over platform sovereignty to come will be fought at the level of the automated urban interface, and will be drawn out not only over gnomic exception, but over also human and humanist exceptionalism. Now, among the structural affordances of stacks in general is their modularity. What occupies a given layer, including a city layer, can be replaced by new things, and insofar as they communicate with the layers above and below according to the protocols of the platform, in the case of the city layer, the address layer above and city cloud layer below, then the whole remains. Not only do stacks accommodate the comprehensive replacement of components, their chief design value is that they enable and encourage it. That is, while the figure of the stack is a figure of totality, it's not static. It's not synchronic. It's made to be remade. And so to articulate the stack we have is already, in some ways, to anticipate the stack to come. Okay, so perhaps another chance we'll talk a little bit more about the stack as such, but with all this in mind, I want to shift a little bit to this discussion from platform sovereignty, according to which the program exception might work at the level of the urban interface, and towards a bit more speculative considerations on the ubiquitous dilution of various computational solvents into the urban fabric, and particularly its skins and surfaces, how states sense. But first, I want to talk very quickly a bit about this question of decoding and the implicit coding that may come before or after that, on how it may take different turns for design. Some turns with which we're more familiar, and others probably less so. The first split may have to do with how software trespasses conventional distinctions between language and technology. That is, one codes, one writes software in a software language according to syntactical norms. And so it's part of a linguistic trajectory. Friedrich Kittler famously suggests that everyone should learn one natural language and one artificial language in order to be a true contemporary cosmopolitan. But unlike natural languages, this code is executable. One can put Java in a machine, and that machine will do what the code tells it to do. Other than human machines, the same cannot be said for English or Chinese language. So code in this sense is a language that is also a technology. But unlike mechanical technologies, it does things according to alphanumerically specific commands, which are only physical commands at the most granular levels. Now, this convertibility between software's linguistic and technical guises may lead us toward a project of decoding that would apply techniques from critical literary or textual analysis to code itself. And decades ago, the impetus to read the city, to decode urban semiotics, to unpack the city as a text may have been the topic. For lots of reasons, the turn away from language and toward new materialist perspectives suggests other pivots, and not necessarily those associated with the new materialism, which in many ways is neither new nor materialist. But similarly, in the post-Snowden shadow of ambient data surveillance and the clarion calls to encrypt communications in response, the politics of decoding, that is, of unraveling or revealing a truth of what has been encoded, is a very slippery game of position and counterposition, like the economies of all camouflage. And instead, I would foreground, I think, other connotations of coding and decoding as an urban design problematic. Despite appearances, they may be more closely related to legal codes that would have subdivided cities into zones so as to preemptively organize urban activities into rational functional divisions. But today, what we take as the sovereignty of such may reside less in the textual prosthetics of the law than in the actual executable software that is from embedded firmware to atmospheric cloud platforms. Is not only do we now ask software to do things that we once asked of architecture, namely the configurable organization of people in place, it also does things that we used to ask the law to do, whether we asked it to or not. So to decode may mean to understand that fact, or it may mean to unwind it on behalf of another city yet to come. My preferred entry point is not one that would prioritize resistance and negation for its own sake, but is one that sees code as something that is or should be there to be overwritten and rewritten. It evolves as well, and does so in relation to its contexts and its users, which includes us, but is not reducible to us only. That is, I'm interested in a projective, as in project, as in projectile, connotation of coding. And there is, I think, much to be said about the implications of both, but very quickly, we may track one project in philosophy, leading through Gilbert Simondon, Bernard Stiegler, for example, that's interested in a kind of technical neo-Lamarckism, for which the coevolution of living beings and technical beings is one in which the phylogenetic lineages of technical objects is an association of mutual assimilation. Our psychological and social individuation is predicated on the inheritance of technological apparatuses that we have both coaxed into becoming and which continue to evolve in ways not reducible to interactions with humans. That is, as our social complexity, including that which our cities host, depends on the inheritance of these non-living, non-genetic, or even epigenetic adaptations, a theory and design for the age of machine intelligence would, I find that the inverse is equally at work. The evolution of technology relies on its own phylogenetic extensions, some of which are other technologies, and some of which are us. The tools are not only our way of accelerating and bypassing genetic evolution, we are also the technologies that technologies use to do the same. And so code at the level of the city may take on any of these. In the composed urban scale complex adaptive system, software can be niche, signal, environment, agent, and or boundary. It can serve diversification and or hierarchy. And the same bit of code may do one or more of these at the same time. It may be a forcing cause of a, quote, genetic or phylogenetic shift. It may be the beneficiary of the same. Perhaps this is why it seems to work so well as a repository of what in early modern era, those that preoccupied Foucault's genealogies and archaeologies, and what he called governmentality. And so a quick word, I'm at my 20 minutes. I wanted to say a few things on machine vision and stuff. Is it okay? All right, yeah. Another word moment on this computational solvent that seems to permeate the present or our descendant form of the city. We take it that, or I would argue that, computation was more discovered than it was invented. That algorithmic generative processes are intrinsic to the wider unfolding of the world, and that our meager provisional computing appliances that we've invented as such are nowhere near as sophisticated and efficient as those that precede Homo sapiens. We take it that computation is one of the ways that matter, in whatever form, achieves intelligence via procedural abstraction. We take it that this dissolution of synthetic computation, or software, into urban fabric provides that landscape of inorganic forms, a sort of distributed intelligence, because it provides that landscape, those objects in the landscape, not so much us, a capacity for abstraction. That is, intelligence as abstraction, computation as intelligence, computation as abstraction. Now, as for design, I want to then quickly hone in on ways that abstraction can be both dermal, as in skin, and cartographic, how it occupies and agitates skins, human skins, building skins, any skin, and how it does so for purposes of mapping. Part of the research that the Center for Design and Geopolitics is engaged with at UC San Diego is in collaboration with the Department of Nanoengineering and Bioengineering. And it's on how presumed differences between natural sensation and machine sensing can be elided by technologies operating in and on the skin at the scale of our dermal and epidermal somatosensory system, mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, et cetera. And by this, I don't mean some kind of O word game for which machines are bequeathed panpsychic capacities of intuition and affect. I refer instead to real-deal techniques by which the biological and non-biological physiochemical reactions are interwoven. Designing chemical sensitivity at or near the atomic level and registration of these as transmissible information with dermal and epidermal microelectronics at larger scales, we conceive a mediatization of sensate surface, And there's many researchers around the world representative of doing similar work. John Rogers at Illinois, Joseph Wang and Todd Coleman at UCSD among them. And then keeping with the skin of human bodies just for one moment, we recognize that while photography and cinema made it possible to compose and to see sorts of images that we had never seen before, montage, slow motion, double exposure, etc. And similar goes for synthetic and recorded sounds in our auditory senses. Our largest sensory organ is our skin. And however, quite obviously, to date, we have not developed nearly as diverse or sophisticated forms of artificial touch, tactility, feeling for skin-based media as we have for vision and hearing. Now, clothing is one way that design has leapfrogged genetic evolution to augment skin. Either it's faster than evolving fur or blubber is to engineer scuba suits. But today's dermal and epidermal media make it possible to sense things about the external world that our skin is otherwise not able to register. Particulate matter in the air, sensed at a parts per trillion sensitivity, or things about our own internal state, pH balance in our sweat, so forth. The longer term and more interesting design horizon, I think, are skin-based media that allow bodies novel and unnatural forms of touch sensation that we have perhaps never experienced before. Pleasure and pain are on the menu, but more besides. Again, early experimental cinema innovations in artificial vision, sights, and sounds are one precedent. Molecular gastronomy and its rebuilding of food from the first chemical principles is another. If we would include taste as a particularly nuanced form of touch, which of course it is, then we see this precedent becomes clear. For human inhabitants of urban ecologies, and non-human as well, inhuman, living or non-living beings alike, what are today novel tastes are models for new sensing and sensations to come. Now, by shifting this line of inquiry, I'll try to go quickly, up to the urban scale, what we take to be artificially mediated surfaces would include things that are analogous to skin, but also to what we today refer to colloquially as machine vision, quote unquote. Now, vision, as you know, is involved independently many times throughout evolutionary history, and arguably in the past 2 decades it has evolved again. This time not for cuttlefish or rattlesnakes, but for network CCD sensors and algorithmic armatures processing what is sensed into differentiated and motivated recognition. Visual, quote unquote, sensors responding to light, often but not always shaped like cameras, are one kind of design surface capable of synthetic sensation and computational interpretation. But in the wider urban landscape, they commingle with networks of other superficial sensors responding to motion, or pressure, or heat, or ambient air qualities. To the extent that it is epistemologically and functionally convenient, we call these variously machine vision, or machine hearing, or machine skin, but any correspondence from and to the mammalian sensory system is merely allegorical. That is, the AI, the artificially intelligent city, may be embodying itself, but not as humans do. A commingling of diverse sensors of light and air and sound and chemistry draws a landscape of sensing and thinking little species, partially embodied discretely one into another, and partially co-embodied with one another and with us as their information inputs are aggregated, modeled, and acted upon in various pluralities. Homo sapiens comes equipped with an extraordinary array of sensory faculties, which may be augmented further by synthetic layers in various ratios, ranging from sensors and trackers in our phones that we carry about like mules, to more intimate media of artificial images and sounds. Situating ourselves in this expanded field, we are both sensors and sensed. On the one hand, we are a primary sapient actor in this drama, supervising an orchestra of sensing technologies, each individually capable of functional processing and together of certain forms of intelligence, as are, for example, neurons or other kinds of cells. On the other, we are not only the subject of this scenario, we are also its subject matter. That wider urban landscape of synthetic sensory systems is not only a platform through which we extend and extrapolate our capacities for abstraction, it is also capable of other sorts of abstraction on its own. As part of its intelligence, it looks at us and registers abstractions about us. And the work of abstraction for urbanism is then not only to deploy abstract forms, but to set in motion mechanisms and programs that are capable of their own feats of abstraction and to calibrate how they abstract us and one another accordingly, which I think was very much from Quinter's point that you read previously as well on the hard and soft formalism. In short, we should imagine an AI urbanism in terms of von Uxkull's stroll into the field, populated by intermingling but mutually oblivious little life worlds, and or in terms of Deleuze's parable of the tick. The later lays in wait for some threshold event to come its way, at which point it triggers its programmed response at and into its own little void. Many of our urban sensors and their limited forms of artificial intelligence work similarly and perhaps with similar nobility. More versatile synthetic intelligences occupy more complex Umwelt. Some are predator, some are prey, some are in motion, some are flowering, some pollinating. And as we stroll among them, we may be registered by them or we may be ignored. We may be a primary cause of concern, or we may be a passing interference in an evolutionary dynamic in which we are neither protagonist nor target. The city is the signaling niche. As many of you know, as we know from shifts from top-down to bottom-up AI have been marked by a shift in emphasis from intelligence as a kind of formal syntax to intelligence as a specifically embodied relation to specific worlds and models. Heuristic knowledge of habitats is inseparable from the manipulation of a specific situated problem space. In robotics, for example, the pairing of synthetic sensing, vision, for example, with algorithmic reasoning allows for simple artificial species to perform intelligently because they have what amounts to functionally embedded perceptual location in their world. It's not that they can see, it's less that they can see because they can think, it's more that they can think because they can see. And ultimately, we may conclude that our conventional Kantian distinctions between perceptual and cognitive faculties is in some ways significantly obsolete. That sensation is a form of thinking, that thinking is inextricable from sensing. In any event, like the protozoa whose cilia provided it with a basic ability of cartographic abstraction of its environs, today's synthetic intelligences, individually and more importantly in aggregate, are not disembodied. They are embodied by machine sensing, machine vision, network sensing in the city and at the scale of the city. The cities we build are in this way not only the habitat about which synthetic intelligences learn embody contextual knowledge, they are also in the distributed sensory apparatuses with which AIs embody that context. The city is, as a platform, as a governing apparatus, is self-incorporating in this way. So less about the role of AI in the city than as AI as a city. Again, to reiterate the point, platforms ultimately don't care if the user is an animal, a vegetable, or a mineral. All users may have platform sovereignty. In security speak, a user is credentialized by three qualifications: something you know, like a password; something you are, like a fingerprint; and something you have, or something you have, like a key card. So if someone or something can be, have, and or know, it can be a user. A trading algorithm, a driverless car, a sans-papier arrivé, a chemical reaction triggering a threshold event, an environmental sensor embedded in a leaf in a rainforest, all users. And with the co-evolutionary logic of code in mind, in its technical as well as ecological guises, I'll conclude just by saying that on behalf of a user suffrage, the complexity and contradictions of platform sovereignty in relation to these non-human users who are nonetheless at least quasi-intelligent sensate actors works to dismember conventional distinctions between subject and tool, occupant and city, subject and apparatus. The agnostic universal suffrage of the user subject position should be claimed as a strongly materialist, not only legal, cosmopolitan territory. In relation to the epidermal biopolitics in the mediatization of urban skins, human sensing, building skins, network sensors, and so on, that evolution from a disciplinary society built of partitions to a society of control built of ambient interfaces may be augmented by this another form, this epidermal biopolitics, built from the granularity of addressable chemical events. This may also shift the comparatively blunt binary logics of control gateways into something more continuous, more dangerous, but also more composable. Thank you.
Much, Benjamin. I can sense people sending publication proposals to MIT Press right now under the title "Sensing Like a State," Sensing Like a State. So for those who are joining us, that was Benjamin Bratton. Bobby Petrusco is going to join us for the second presentation before we're going to take a break. And Vaijanti Rao and John Van Nostrand will be joining us afterwards as well.
Good morning. It's funny, the first few sentences out of my mouth always feel like kind of stuttery because I haven't spoken in public in 24 hours or whatever, but, so I'll warm up as I go. I want to thank Alex and Ghazal for having me, and for Pierre and Benjamin for those two opening presentations. I think it does a lot of the hard work for me, because I'm going to be zooming into a historical case study that I think connects to some of the larger issues, but it takes them as assumed. I'm going to be working very close to the materials used to create a series of land cover categories. It's a technique which, pretentious or not, I've been calling an esocartology, which is an interior study of the map-making practice, looking very specifically at the organization of work around the materials that produce maps themselves and how they relate to standards and the knowledge we use to create geographic reasoning. On June 28th, 1971, the U.S. Geological Survey and NASA convened a 3-day conference on the topic of land information and classification. With the imminent launch of NASA's new Earth Resources Technology Satellite, ERTS, now known as Landsat, the agencies were attempting to better understand how high-altitude imagery recorded by the satellite could be put to use for urban planning, resource management, and geographical research at large. The conference was the first project of a newly established steering committee tasked with creating a single land use classification scheme that would be deployable at the national scale and commensurate with the expansive new vision that the ERT satellite would provide. Now, we all know the categories that I'm talking about. They're now in common usage, they're banal. They're in many geospatial data sets. They're things like cropland, wetlands, high and low density development, all of these things, the terms that we take for granted when doing large scale mapping. These were determined by the discussions at this conference and were actively debated what the appropriate terms would be for a set of mutually exclusive categories to be deployed at the scale of the nation. Dr. Ernest E. Hardy of Cornell University's Center for Aerial Photographic Interpretation presented one of the keynote papers, speaking from experience gained during a recently completed study of New York State's land use. He highlighted a, quote, major problem of concepts in connecting remote vision with the creation of a land use classification scheme. So here's Hardy at the conference. No sound? Excuse me. No. Do we have it now? There.
A major problem of concept has developed over time, and I want to point out that the classification of land use is commonly a practice that is generated in terms of the needs of information for a particular classification system. We tend to take an existing classification system and then turn to our remote sensors and say, well, how much of this can you give us? What we will probably make more progress with more rapidly in terms of the extraction of information from remote sensors is to take the reverse approach and take the remote sensor and ask ourselves, what information about land use can we get from air photos? Rather than designing first a very comprehensive and complete land use classification and then going to the air photos to find out about it.
So we're going to be focusing on this inversion that Hardy proposes here. Later, in a session debating the list of land use categories under consideration, Hardy made proposals from the preferential view of the photo interpreter. He urged that the term pasture not be used. What was commonly understood on the ground as pasture proved, quote, difficult to identify in an air photo. Hardy's statements exemplified what would soon become an important, if latent, epistemic virtue for the emerging discipline of satellite-based remote sensing. Categories of land use were not independent of the technology used to gather them, or of the human photo interpreters who analyzed them. Rather than exhaustively cataloging the many land uses readily perceived from the ground, a successful classification scheme would parcel the world into a set of categories, and only those categories, that interpreters could repeatedly recognize in the tones and patterns of remotely sensed imagery. And as I'm going to discuss in a moment, this interpretability was also shaped by the organizational design of the analyst's workflow. Ultimately, Hardy co-authored the classification scheme debated at the conference, a land use land cover classification for use with remote sensors, was published by the USGS in 1976. As some of you know, this episode that I'm discussing right now is part of a larger project of kind of unpacking the history of land cover as a data set and as a term that we use in such common practice now. This classification scheme has provided the criteria and categories for every comprehensive land cover data set released since its circulation. And so here we see a little bit of the historical backtracking all the way from 1976 up to the National Land Cover Database of 2006, which is still the scheme that we use today. This conference and the resultant publication is a moment when this list of land categories became standardized and naturalized at the national level. From that moment on, they became the infrastructure on which vast geospatial data sets are built. To better understand what these land use categories represent, I'd like to step backwards and look closely at Hardy's previous project, the Land Use and Natural Resource Inventory of New York State, or LUNAR. In this project, the enumeration and definition of land use categories are the primary concern, and they're not yet taken for granted. This project, that Hardy himself described as being, quote, developed on a highly pragmatic basis, rather than satisfying any particular set of theoretical constructs, made him uniquely equipped to standardize land use at a national level. So for LUNAR, was a project between 1976 and 1971. Was organized by the Office of Planning Coordination of New York State, and they commissioned Cornell University's Center for Aerial Photographic Interpretation to conduct an inventory that would, quote, assess and portray the present extent, character, and uses of the land and water resources of the entire state. Given the ambitious scale of the inventory, traditional methods of enumeration, such as on-the-ground field surveys, they were deemed unfeasible, and aerial photographic analysis was proposed instead. This was the recommendation of Cornell's team under the direction of Ernest Hardy. LUNAR was a project of many translations, from images to maps to tabular aggregates to computer databases. the ground was successively abstracted into representational forms that could circulate among multiple state agencies and be put to work in arbitrary user-defined analysis. The combination of all these representational forms is what Susan Lee Starr would otherwise call a cascade of representation, where multiple data sets are brought into registration, a kind of density of evidence of what was actually being perceived on the ground. And we see it here, the pulling together of field notes, USGS topological quadrangles, the air photos themselves, and other statistical supplemental data. During the project, a team of 50 photo interpreters visually classified 15,000 black and white aerial images. The continuous tones and patterns of the images were delineated into discrete land use categories and drafted onto Mylar maps. These maps were overlaid with a 1 kilometer grid through which the land use areas were hand aggregated into tabular forms and then ultimately entered into a computer database from which, quote, billions of custom maps could be derived. The land use areas for the entire state could be represented in a single table, as could arbitrary comparisons between any number of counties. All right, so we're used to seeing some of this kind of early computerized cartographic representation, especially here at the GSD. There's a strong connection between the work of the Lab for Computer Graphics that was working in the 60s and this project. And in fact, excuse me? Oh yeah, graphically for sure. Here are the tabular aggregates. So the billions of maps, the ability to compare different counties in New York State or treat the whole thing as a whole, required a sort of standardization or commensurability between the land use categories in order to represent it. These categories were that kind of initial transition from the continuous visual patterns in aerial images to the discrete classes that we see here. The design of these categories and the workflow for their interpretation was a major component of the project's development and prominently documented over its duration. So as a historical test case, the amount of paper and words devoted to how they arrived at the categories and the workflow for processing them and interpreting them kind of gives an indicator of what they thought their project was, even if in the original project brief it isn't stated that the design of classification and interpretation is the project. If we're doing raw word counts, that in fact is where they spent most of their energy. The inventory was almost an afterthought. So the rest of the paper, I'm going to focus on the relationship among Lunar's representational materials, its techniques of interpretation, and the resultant categories of land use. And through a close analysis of this relationship, I hope to demonstrate 3 points. The first is that the techniques of image interpretation determined the land use categories in the scheme. So this is similar to the Hardy claim before that we heard. Rather than working with an a priori classification of things out in the world, the air photos themselves became the site of analysis, and only categories that could be repeatedly associated with visual patterns extracted from the images were considered for the classification scheme. All right, so the space of possibility was determined in that relationship between the image and the eye. Secondly, the process of interpretation was not a simple mapping from image to eye to category, but was shaped by the photographs and maps themselves. Their methods of inventory and material properties defined the boundaries of work for the interpreters, as well as the hierarchy of decision-making in the project regarding the appropriate list of land use categories. I'm going to be talking about that in detail in a moment. And as a result of these first 2 claims, land use classification in Lunar was not chiefly concerned with the ground as an independent object, as we might conventionally assume, but rather it is a scheme based on the full constellation of material and institutional properties of the workflow. Okay, I was supposed to show these slides while I was just talking. I got a little lost in the words.
Happens to us all the time.
But I like to show these quite a bit. These come from different textbooks during the time. This is the first, the kind of common view of what air photo interpretation is that the image itself is a transparent lens that gives access to the ground from a particular altitude, whereas in fact I'm arguing that this diagram is more useful, which is that classification of the ground is primarily an operation of the 10 inches between the eye and the image. Lunar's land categories began with a list from the Office of Planning Coordination in '66. It included land, water, minerals, and 5 other categories of very generally defined natural resources. However, within 5 years, this number of categories would reach 81. While designing the land use classification, previous schemes were considered. Most notably is the Standard Land Use Coding Manual, or SLUC, which was developed in 1965 by the Bureau of Urban Renewal. This contained over 700 categories of human land use, and the SLUC was specifically designed for projects like Lunar. They were trying to come up with a standard that was so comprehensive that every project dealing with land use would want to use it. However, despite SLUC's comprehensive nature, Hardy and his team deemed it unusable for a project based on aerial photo interpretation, citing both the density of categories and the length of codes themselves, so the actual codes associated with each of these different categories, the 4-digit codes at the end in particular, such as 4411. SLUC divided land use in a manner that was not easily discerned in the tone and patterns of an air photo, and the length of its codes were difficult to map by hand. They simply would not fit within the regions they described on the map. So the rejection of SLUC demonstrates that at a very early stage, the physical properties of images and maps were already shaping decisions regarding the appropriate categories to use in the project. So hand plus pencil plus very small boundary on a map deemed certain categories unusable here. So the material properties of the workflow are shaping what categories we're saying describe land use and the categories on the ground. Lunar's categories were instead designed within the photo interpretation lab. Beginning in February 1967, the team received a collection of air photos covering Cortland County in New York State. Each image was photographed in black and white at a scale of 1 to 24,000 and developed in a 9 by 9 inch format. On a table in the center of the lab, the images were layered into a mosaic. The team gathered around them and began identifying various visual patterns. Each pattern was assigned a land use category, and a list of those under consideration was maintained and modified on the lab blackboard. Thus, the classification of land use began with the image interpretation process itself, rather than with the ground. Over the course of 2 months, the team all, quote, gradually began to agree what these land use categories should be, and indeed, many of those decisions were made as they stood around the map mosaic of the pilot area, using it as a continual reference and focus for discussion. Within the continuous visual sensations of the images, what combination of tone and texture constituted a pattern? All right, so these are the questions they were asking themselves. Could the pattern be repeatedly identified across a team of interpreters? Where should discrete boundaries between the patterns be drawn? And once the surface of the image has been fully delineated, to which category should the patterns be assigned? An interpretive consensus determined how the space of land use would be defined. Despite this initial agreement, the scheme was revised. I'm reviving it now. The scheme was revised 12 times during the project. The feasibility of the categories were continually judged based on the interpretation workflow developed alongside them. So normally we would think, all right, even if they establish categories independently, they're established, they're taken as fact, and then the interpretation process happens alongside it. What instead happened here is that the categories of what was on the ground were revised based on the interpretation work and how accurately they could do this classification. So to quote Hardy again, discussions of the techniques for the inventory had paralleled, influenced, and had been influenced by the development of the classification. The techniques, for the most part, evolved in that same lab room. While the tones and patterns of the imagery determined the initial space of possible land use categories, these categories were further shaped by the specificity of an interpretation process. And as this process evolved, so did the official list of land use categories. All right, so to be clear, the work I'm describing here is not just accurately classifying images into pre-established categories. Instead, I want to show how this act of classifying images, when distributed across a team, revealed that some categories produced uncertainty and error more than others. And this lack of consensus, specifically related to the materials and organization of the interpretation process, is what caused the modification of land use and ultimately the standards we now use today. So to dig into the interpretation process here, I'm going to get a little maniacal, but it's important to do this kind of close reading of the process because this is actually where the shaping of the categories comes from. First, interpretation, photo interpretation, in Lunar, like any other project, appears as a straightforward translation from the continuous tones and patterns of an air photo to the discrete boundaries of a land use map. However, in this case, the act of interpretation itself was strictly defined in relation to the material properties of the images and maps, as well as the interaction among several institutional timescales in the project, and I'm going to return to those at the very end. The factors structured the work of the interpreters, and through their performance, redefined the set of land use categories. Underlying the project's workflow was a collection of USGS topographic maps that parcel the country into evenly spaced 7.5 degree grid. Each of the grid cells, or quadrangles, is given a unique locational code and associated with a 24 by 36 inch standalone topographic map. Both the unique location code and the physical map were important determinants in the interpretation workflow. First, the topographic map codes and their corresponding grid cells provided the organizational structure through which all of the media in the project was cataloged. For instance, aerial photos were received in flight strips, so linear flights across the ground, which would make sense as a visual pattern, but they were then sorted and filed by the USGS topographic maps according to the location of their principal points. All right, these are the codes. Here they are filed. I'm very diligent. The importance of this resorting is this, that images contained by an individual quadrangle were stored together as a group and ordered by that grid cell's unique code. And as a result, the original spatial adjacencies among the images were disrupted, as were any land use patterns depicted across multiple image boundaries. As we'll see in a moment, this disruption resulted in an error checking procedure that was important for the continual modification of the land use categories. So even decisions about inventory, of dealing with all this large data, connects to the organization of the work that shapes the land use categories. All of these things are in play. Second, as a 24 by 36 inch surface, the topographic map organized the work of an individual interpreter. Each interpreter worked with one quadrangle at a time and retained authority over it through its numerous translations from imagery to categories to code. So in terms of kind of interpreter jurisdiction, when they're working on a single quadrangle, they can make the decisions about the code and classification accuracy, and they're sort of in charge of it all the way through. So beginning with a simple quadrangle, they arrange multiple air photos into alignment with its borders. And then drawing directly on the photographs with a wax pencil, they delineated bounded image patterns and assigned them land use codes. Within the boundaries of the topographic map, interpreters had this full authority. All right, so here it is. They creating the mosaic on the quad and then laying the mylar on top of it. However, the boundaries between adjacent maps produced a different organizational logic. And this directly connected them to the hierarchy of decision-making and that modification of land use codes that I was talking about. All right, because of the material sizes of the different things at work here, the 9 by 9 inch air photos did not fit neatly within the map boundaries. All right, so the pattern of the images drifted across the borders of multiple maps, and therefore across the work boundary of multiple interpreters. So they enter into a place of kind of multiple jurisdiction. These boundaries then became sites of competing work. In addition to a map's interior, interpreters were expected, I don't know if you can see it here, that black. Interpreters were expected to classify land uses along a 1 inch margin beyond its north and west edges. So patterns on a single map straddled adjacent maps and were therefore classified by separate interpreters at different times, producing discrepancies both in the perceived categories and in the location of their boundaries. You can see it a bit more clearly there. So there's the contested boundary between 4 interpreters. This kind of terrain was reflected in the lunar organizational chart. There was a single role created called the tie-in specialist. The sole task of the tie-in specialist was to resolve the differences between adjacent maps, deciding the appropriate categories and extent. In these margins, they were given full decision-making authority. And classification discrepancies they observed had two effects. One, interpreters in error were retrained on the proper class. Or if a category was found to be repeatedly problematic, the category itself was changed and the classification scheme updated. So it's in these boundaries because they split up the images based on the quads and then the images drifted across the work boundaries. These margins became the place where discrepancies between interpretation were registered, and therefore land use categories were deleted, other categories were aggregated. Thus, the topographic map was not merely the surface on which work happened. Its size and physical borders defined the work and structure of authority in the project. Again, the interior of the map remained under the jurisdiction of the individual interpreter, but its edges and material misalignments reached deeper into Lunar's organizational hierarchy. So I've been using the term interpretation, and we all have kind of an image of the work in mind when I'm talking about that. But interpretation was very specifically designed in Lunar. And here, hopefully, implicitly, I can connect this a little bit to the end of Benjamin's presentation. Maybe I step back for a second. The categories in the interpretation process were entangled in a profound way in the measurement of classification speed. Staff researcher Raymond Krieg defined interpretation in highly specific terms. I'm going to read a quote here from a paper published at the time. Lunar does not require true photo interpretation. This act requires a highly trained deductive and inductive evaluation of air photo patterns. Instead, this project only requires photo reading, which involves simple recognition, making the classification time very small, a matter of seconds. The difference between interpretation and recognition was elsewhere established as being between 10 to 15 seconds per category. Despite the more nuanced information that may be gathered from a process of detailed inspection, the classification scheme was designed so, quote, categories could be easily separated by the interpreters in the interest of keeping classification times down. The interpreter still required observational powers to decide among a variety of visual sensations and patterns, but the discrete boundaries between them and their land use labels were determined elsewhere in the project hierarchy. Right, so this is an interesting relationship for me between seeing and thinking, or actually humans as sensors here. The interpreters are not a skilled staff. They're not expected to have any particular relationship to the ground or any expertise in geography. And in fact, it was deemed better to have someone that had none of that experience because they wouldn't bring preconceptions into it. The 10-second boundary kind of created a situation where the categories under inspection weren't even extracting the full amount of information from the images that an interpreter could do on their own. It became a processing rate. So any category that repeatedly took more than 10 seconds to classify was jettisoned, and categories were aggregated together. The division between photo reading and photo interpretation, and I'll say between perception and judgment, was reflected in the land use categories themselves. This actually gets even weirder. So-called wastebasket classes were included at each level of the schema to collect patterns requiring longer classification times. These categories, such as brushland, curtailed an interpreter's transition from perception to judgment and translated the boundary of a perceptual process into a boundary of land use. So at a point, if you were working on a ground and you found that certain parts of the ground were taking you too long to classify, we'll just throw this into brushland. And different parts in the scheme had these wastebasket classes. So there's the pattern of perceptual inaccuracy reinscribed on the ground. The project's emphasis on photo recognition over photo analysis required unique and rapid training procedures, and these disciplined workers to focus solely on optical sensations. while suspending personal sense-making of the patterns. Lunar's photo interpreters were therefore a departure from that highly skilled specialized worker common to the fields of photogrammetry and aerial reconnaissance. So those heroic stories we hear of World War II, such as the book Air Spy. This is a different type of work here. In seeking out candidates for the team, quote, extensive air photo interpretation experience was not necessary nor even desirable. There's the wastebasket classes again, actually on the ground, and we can see some of the photo patterns. During training, interpreters were introduced to the project's photo interpretation key, and this key associated land uses with their image patterns. The accompanying text described each land use in terms of tone, pattern, and geometry observable in the air photos. Despite the prosaic names used in the classification, agriculture, residential, forest, and so on, the ambition was to, quote, redefine conventional categories in a manner appropriate to the scope of analysis. For instance, vineyards were defined as having a, quote, distinctive crosshatch pattern in small isolated parcels, whereas cropland might vary from a fine textured mottled look to darker tonal characteristics. Interpreters first learned how to see the patterns, then create institutionally valid distinctions between them, and then finally assign them to specific categories. I kind of want to pause on this for a second. The official categories of New York State and its land cover, the description of those categories are from the point of view of someone looking at a photograph. Right? Agricultural land is a mottled texture, dark tones. Has nothing to do with the actual processes happening on the ground. The justification for this shift in training from photo interpretation to photo recognition was tied to the larger institutional timescale of the project. Lunar was understood as a repeatable workflow for converting imagery into land use aggregates, a process that was meant to exist independent of the specific skills of an individual interpreter. Hardy intended for changes in land use to be measured every 10 years, and this would necessitate a different team each time. It was important that pattern recognition comprise the individual's work, while pattern interpretation remain organizationally defined. So the work of the interpreter was to register these optical sensations, not to reason about them. If they could map them to a code in the book, then they would just deploy that category. With a decades-long project in mind, Hardy recognized, quote, what may appear obvious to a photo interpreter today in terms of identifying a particular land use may have little or no meaning to interpreters in the future. Though a common subjective understanding of land use categories could not be assumed across long durations, interpreters had a physiologically persistent ability to recognize image patterns and assign them to predetermined categories, regardless of what those categories might be. So in the space between an eye and an air photo, and the required 10-second classification time, these were linked with an institutional duration of decades, right? So that interest in the 10-second classification time was produced by the fact that they were going to repeat this with a novel team every time. In conclusion, Lunar's categories and interpretation process were important precursors to the national and global land use land cover data sets that emerged alongside the field of satellite-based remote sensing. As mentioned in the introduction, Lunar's categories were explicitly, quote, modified to make applicable to the country as whole in the US Geological Survey scheme, still widely used. So Lunar was stated explicitly as a precursor, and these processes, in fact, were used during the development of those codes. Lunar is not only important because of the lineage that follows it, but because it highlights a shift in focus from ground to lab that occurred with the introduction of remote sensors. The categories used to create discrete classes from continuous imagery were optimized for repeated and agreed upon interpretability within the lab, opposed to a concern for accurate representations of the ground. It is the moment when the ground is first conceived not as an independent object, but as one component in a complicated information flow, connecting the radiant properties of materials, the transmission capacity of the atmosphere, electromagnetic sensors, the storing properties of images, the haptic limitations of hands and pencils, and the visual attention of interpreters. And then furthermore, on top of this, the process of interpretation was disciplined by specific organizational workflows in relation to the representational materials themselves. As one member of the steering committee put it so eloquently in 1964, quote, "The Earth itself can be thought of as an information source in a communication system. One of our research tasks will be to learn more about the structure of this information source. This will lead us in one direction toward approving theory so that we will be able to make better requests for data from the environment." So this is a bit of the environment as a database that they're requesting information from. It's an information source. Projects like Lunar highlight the latent, quote, "where of things" in the production of geospatial data. So where does geospatial data happen? Is it the space between the ground and the sensor, or is it elsewhere? Or all? By exploring the organizational and material conditions of this workflow, we reintroduce human capacities and decision-making to the production of vast geographic scale. And it opens them up to inspection and continued experimentation, sort of the innovation that was mentioned in the Foucault quote earlier. While these discount the claims of, quote, "raw data" that might otherwise place such data sets outside of debate. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so welcome back to part 2 of our morning session. We're going to be joined, we just had Benjamin Bratton with Bobby Perchusco present as part of this panel called Unsettling. And we are now joined by John Van Nostrand and Vaijayanti Rao. Just very briefly, to introduce them so that we can get underway and then a conversation to wrap up the morning. John is the founding principal of SVN Architects and Planners. Over the last, aptly, the 3 decades, John's been the driving force behind the firm's operations, domestic and international, rooted in both planning and urban design practices, which makes him incredibly unique just in terms of type of practice. He has extensive experience both leading very large multidisciplinary teams in different parts of the world, dealing with both architectural, urban, and also environmental projects, both in Canada and outside. Specifically also related to a number of mine-related housing projects in Africa, Latin America, and northern Canada, or boreal Canada, as John will speak about. He's also worked in a wide range of developed and developing countries on planning, design, and construction of new communities, ranging from in size from 150 to 150,000 people. His work's been recognized with a number of international, national awards, including World Leadership Award for Town Planning, Daniel Burnham Award from the American Planning Association, World Habitat Award from UN Habitat, and a number of awards from Ontario Association of Landscape Architects. Architects. I'm actually proposing that you should get an award from the Association of Landscape Architects. So I'm glad this is live. If you're listening, the OLA,
Right.
the gentleman here should be awarded at some point in the near future. And then finally, I just mentioned, I think notably, he was awarded the Jane Jacobs Award for Ideas That Matter very recently. He also serves here at the GSD as part of the core professional committee on Harvard University's Working Group on Sustainable Cities. Please welcome John Van Nostrand.
Thanks very much, Pierre. And I'm just going to get right into this and try and hold to 20 minutes so we can have some discussion, because I think it sounds like it's going to be pretty intriguing. So I'm also talking about patterns, but maybe in a slightly different way, or for sure in a slightly different way. And I start off with Rickard's quote about Rome, of course, the great idea of a town, for those of you who haven't read it, amazing book. So investigations level, so after the British lost the 13 colonies in the American Revolution, they holed up in Quebec and had to analyze what was going to happen to the 14th, which is where I live, now called Canada. And they decided that what their analysis was that they hadn't, and this goes right back to the very beginning of it today, wasn't that they'd overtaxed people or they disrupted them, or it was just they lost control of land. So they said, what we're going to do in Canada is we're going to subdivide the land in advance of settlement, and then we're going to hand it out one lot by lot to people who come. And these were the models, the instructions to surveyors. So this was not unusual for the British, because town planning surveying, physical planning, and land surveys and physical planning was a chief department of the colonial force. Those were its main agencies of settlement, aside from the gun, which was used. But I think that that department had a much bigger effect on the world than did any of the guns that were fired. These were the instructions of surveyors for how to survey the townships in Canada. So those, one is 9 by 12, the rectangle, and the other one is 12 by 12. And the idea was if it's on a body of water, a town surrounded by a common, surrounded by lots that were small farm lots for people to provide subsistence agriculture, if you can believe it, to those people who lived in the town, and then larger farms beyond in 9 concessions, and then the inland version on the right. And that was the deployment, the diagram of how that would be deployed at the start. So this was the largest survey ever undertaken in the world at this point in time, which is around 1800 plus or minus, 1800 to 1805. And you can see the distribution of the different kinds of survey plans, including the inland ones. And you see the ones going up the Ottawa River, which was the main highway, to use that term, to the west, which was then, of course, Western Canada or Western Ontario borders was the most productive economic zone in the British Empire for 300 years before this, mostly because of beavers. And this gets into the very interesting thing, and I've written extensively, I won't go into it that extensively, but to say that, so the actual surveying of a township began with laying the base line, which is a very common word in Canada. People live on base lines. And you would move north, in this case, away from the lake. The lands below the base line were deemed to be uncivilized, really. They were called, the concessions all had numbers. These were called lots, and these were just numbered with A's and B's. And really what was happening is they were extinguishing, two things were happening. One is they were extinguishing the tenure south of that line or below that line and opening up new tenure north of it. Because who lived, in fact, that bay in the middle was called Frenchman's Bay and still is, because the French and native people lived along the lakeshore, of course. It was the lakefront. But also they were subverting a relationship with nature, and I think quite consciously. This is a contentious topic, but I think if now having worked in a lot of British colonies elsewhere in the world, I think there was really an effort to neutralize one's relationship with nature, because if you fell in love with a lake or the hill or the valley or the marsh, chances are you would soon get tired of reporting to somebody 5,000, 6,000 miles away and take up arms to defend that landscape. We've never done that. You did it. You did it here. And you can see this is a very serious, this huge area was surveyed in a very short period of time, and that was the kind of state of the land one had to work with, so cutting lines. And another form of control was to actually, what interesting idea, tied the economy to the whole process, because the Crown decided to hold land back from settlement so that it could sell it as value was added downstream, so that it could pay for federal or municipal or provincial infrastructure. And also the church got in on the game and said, well, we need money too because we're civilizing these people and building churches. So there was on the far right, those are lots held back for church and clergy for crown and clergy reserves, were sold off over time. But what it was also doing really was to make sure that nobody could ever take more than 3 farm lots. So no one political group or seditious group could actually consolidate a large piece of land. It broke them up from the beginning. And then similarly, the way land was handed out in the 9 concessions, if you imagine that picture before going back from the lake, in the first concession, land went to the aristocracy. We call them the family compact that lived in Toronto, probably had never been here, but were awarded that land. The second concession went to the officers of the British Army. The third concession went to the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, privates, and the fourth concession and fifth concession went to privates and friendly sort of allies. My family were Dutch, so we were in the fourth concession. And 6 and 7 were Scottish, and 8 and 9 were Irish. Is that simple? in terms of how that land was allocated. Well, it wasn't, of course, that simple, but that was the protocol, let's to use the term here. But underneath that, and I sort of call it pattern one, because pattern two was what showed us pattern one, and we're only just discovering pattern one or rediscovering, where of course there were lots of people living here before the British came in 1800. And this is an early map that shows the distribution of what we call First Nations ownership through that territory between the lakes and up to Montreal. And so the Crown passed the Indian Act of Canada, in which the Indian population, or the First Nations, surrendered their land. This is not in any of the treaties. The treaties do not use the word surrender, but the government would be labeling it as surrendering, in fact, their rights to the land. In fact, that's a very contentious term now. So they gave up their occupancy and ownership, and in fact were consciously moved away from their original village sites or settled areas, if I can put it that way. And in fact, the Indian Act of Canada, some of you probably know, was the root of the apartheid system in South Africa. This act was studied for 2 years in Ottawa and then transferred, and led to the displacement and disorientation of the black population there. And just to say that this wasn't just land that was being held, there were some pretty sophisticated forms of settlement going on. Some were so-called pastoral and some were fixed. The Hurons, Wendat were a fixed group, and you can see the number of villages just in that area, and they all looked something like this. So very well established, and actually planned for expansion as well. You can see how the diagram up at the top. So very sophisticated thinking from the beginning, and that palisade could be added to and subtracted from pretty easily, and you ended up with a place that looked like that. The problem, the disorganization being that when you try to front in every body of water, somewhere you got to resolve that geometry, and you get very confused townships and parcels of land. And that strip through the middle is actually one of the ways they opened up new areas, was to set a road out first that had lots along it, and you operate off from that road. That system was also then repeated in Western Canada. So I call this post-colonial, because that was done by the Land Department of Land's Physical Planning, and this was done by the Government of Canada in 1916. And it was in anticipation of a resource called wheat, or resource in the prairies. Nobody knew what that resource was going to be, but the first person who went out was, 2 agronomists were sent out. First one went out in a drought year and came back and said, "You'll never grow anything on the prairies, forget it." And the second one went out 3 years later at the aegis of another railway company, because the first one was tied to one railway company, and the other went out and said, "This is a fantastic place for wheat, and here's where it is," and he staked out the train line, in fact. And the government, meanwhile, was subdividing the land up and using a very similar system that was used before to allocate land to the provinces, in this case, for cover the cost of schools, to allocate railway land, and you can see it, significant railway land. It was 10,000 acres that a railway company per mile of railway was allocated, that they would then settle and take the profits off. And the Hudson's Bay Company was deemed to be the only legitimate sort of retail trading company to work with, so they got their line as well. And then we see the deployment of that on the actual curvature of the world, which is I think a first example of this. I think it's very interesting, actually, talking about topography, because mapping was a huge tool of the British Empire, in the sense that you unwittingly let people in to sort of map the territory for you, but they got to know the land better than you had ever known it as an Indian, an East Indian or a Canadian or a Palestinian or whatever, and then the land was taken from you by people who had that knowledge. So this just gives you some sense of what that begins to look like. And you see up on the top that people had pre-settled here. These would be French and Métis. The Métis were the French trading company that predated the Hudson's Bay, and they were settling along the rivers and taking advantage of the topography as they had always done. And their form of settlement, it's a bit crude in that little map in the corner, but with the long linear seigneuries, so that everybody got a front on the river and the land extended back from that. So that's the same pattern that we have in Quebec. And then you can just see the overlay of this new grid, and you can just see the beginning of it being added here. And what's interesting in this photograph, in one way too, is to the right of the block, the first block that's being surveyed that's Northern Ontario, the next province, before it was blocked out. So it was still a sort of wild state. But because the wheat was here, and you can see that these are the First Nations holdings in that particular case. And there's the overlay, one of the first overlays that show the application of that new form of grid. And then I think this is a really fascinating map because it shows many things, but it does show the topography because the British by this point actually knew how to map that and chart it, which is significant. The grid itself, and then it shows the train lines, and you can see that they're following topography too. They really have very little to do with the grid. And they were sort of off grid all the time and creating parcels of land that then people took their own tenure on. And also you see those the names of the stations you probably can't see, but somebody discovered that if they're going to get wheat, not discovered, but realized if you get wheat, you have to collect it in elevators. And somebody calculated that to get to the farthest farm and back to the elevator in October, the harvest season was a 4-mile journey max in order to coordinate the collection of wheat. Because if you got out of a day's cycle, you'd be in trouble with somebody stuck out overnight. And so every 8 miles, there was a town, the two radii. So this is power switching from federal government to provincial government to railways, basically. It's very much on the path of what we were talking about earlier. And this just shows you very quickly so there's the corridor. In fact, in the end, the railway got a 10-mile wide corridor and the land alongside it, as opposed to the block by block, because they said, well, we need this land. They got the best land, actually, from the beginning, right adjacent to the railway. And you can just see very quickly, so 1886, 1896, you can just see the growth that's happening. And I might also say that the colors here, red and gray, are interesting because the British try to recruit people from the United Kingdom to come to settle here, but they didn't get enough, so they started to, against great objections from government, central government, started to get people from other parts of Europe, God forbid. Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, Dutch, all kinds of different people who moved to the gray areas. And around each elevator, they laid out a standard town plan, which is in a way brilliant. I mean, obviously somebody realized the train stops, there could be a town here, but they did this well in advance of any kind of settlement. So I think we have about 1,700 small towns in Canada. I'm not sure what that number is, but there are 800 of them in Saskatchewan and Alberta in the southern part along the railway. And there's what you were trying to do first. So behind all this, there was a reluctance. The British had gone through a big decision because in fact, the man who was sent out to do the early surveys that I showed first, Simcoe, who had done such a brilliant job, by 1850 and 1820, the British had realized that, or thought there was really nothing in Canada to resource-wise or trade-wise, and nothing that they could see they really needed. So he was sent off to India because they decided that would be the main focus of their colonization plans. But it was also at that time that there was a movement by people to say, well, hold it, we British don't agree with what's happened here, and really the key here is not with regard to the local subdivisions, they're arbitrary and artificial, but nature has taken hold of the young Canadian mind and molding it its own image. And nature is tied to geology and resources and the way the occupancy of the land happens in terms, those resources, like the beavers before you, we didn't need a survey to extract those beavers and all the related trade that went along with that. And so this sort of dichotomy started of the grid, the sort of imposed grid versus the kind of natural landscape playing a role in that. That, and you can see just to show the impact of that today, that's a photograph that was, so I have the old map up on the top, but I have a picture that was created of the Toronto region in 1971 where, so this was the first time people actually realized, and my wife doesn't like me saying this, but that underlying this whole grid was a natural topography. They hadn't really discovered it. So this is like a major discovery for my generation of planners that, in fact, we had many, many rivers that were now covered over. We had a moraine sort of ridge. We had an escarpment. And that led to a kind of more recent combination of nature with the grid to sort of, and you can see the grid isn't even expressed here. And then a whole new round of photography, sort of aerial photography, to go back to it, in which you can read the topography but not the grid. I mean, you can see it if you look finely at the browner areas, that the superimposition is still in play, but a whole kind of new way of looking at the place. And that tied in with some early work I started to do was looking at, in 1967, somebody said, hey, you know, and these are the maps that we Canadians all live within 300 miles of the border. If we take that line and move it up to the tree line, that band there, which he called the Mid-Canada Corridor, and I later renamed it the Boreal Corridor, just simply because it translates, but that holds 75% of our wealth in terms of mining and forestry, and we should be doing a plan for this, to look at how we're going to extract that. But also, so these are some of the maps I used, but also what was unique here, sort of ecologically, is that big band there is our boreal forest, which goes coast to coast. So that's the mixed deciduous coniferous forest. You know, some people actually even, there are a number of First Nations I worked with who claim that actually they planted the boreal forest. It was something, they intermixed the trees. And there actually is a distinct pattern of particularly rich parts of the boreal forest and First Nation settlement across it. So I don't know, you know, but a really important, valuable environmental. Just watching my time here; it's running out, isn't it? It's temperate and habitable, so you can actually live there. There are the geology, the resources in it that are yet to be exploited. And I went back 4 years ago and looked at, so what has happened since then? And basically you're looking at most of our major, and extraction, as you all know, at this end, and oil and gas and mining and potash, et cetera, all has been happening in that corridor. And so there is a shift now to be thinking about the planning, the replanning, or the unplanning, as I call it, if I'm not using that too abstractly, the unplanning of that area to make way for this new resource development and the attraction of people who are likely, because we're parallel with this, we're the fastest growing country in the G8. We'll have about 300,000 immigrants alone this year, not to mention the refugees. It's a very growing place, and so there's an overlap there. And you can see the effect of that corridor on our built-up areas, and the First Nations population within it. And then the discovery sort of recently, too, that in fact First Nations, sorry. Didn't think I had that on. I'll just wrap up here quickly, but the First Nations have in fact mapped that area well before the British even showed up. This is a Cree map of that western part of Canada, how to get out from the Great Lakes across and out to Western Canada by water. And also then some work we've been doing in the oil sands. This is some mapping that was put together by these nations, just to give you a sense of their sort of occupancy of the land. So really the government now is talking about sort of regional planning as if it's a brand new exercise in this part of the world. And we're saying, well, actually, it's always been happening here. And people have a very good sense of regions. In fact, we actually have to tell them again, remind them that they had a regional plan already that they were working to. They lived in certain places in the winter, the summer, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see how big that area is. Just I've overlaid it on the Canada map, so it's almost a major part of northern. This area here is that little map there. And the person who really sort of outed this was a British, of course, but socioeconomist who was doing a study of the Mackenzie Valley, which was being slated for oil development. And he went to document this, and he's written a book. He wrote a book called Maps and Dreams, which is quite extraordinary. Because, of course, socioeconomic analysis at that point was based a lot on the same kind of mapping we've been talking about earlier. And he was doing mapping, lots of mapping. And it took him the first year before he discovered that actually people did mapping here already. And in fact, hunters were people in these communities were people who dreamt, and they would dream where moose were or caribou, and they would get up in the morning and go to the chief's tent, and they'd make a map of where the moose was. And he documented the fact that 8 out of 10 times when they got there, the moose was there. So they knew this land intimately. And these are some of the mapping that led to his sort of larger map of that whole territory, saying these are pastoral people, but they have regional plans they're working to, and that so put this on the map, so to speak. And I think having more and more and more influence, because this is underneath those maps are great resources. And then also he documented, Hugh Brody documented the change in the Indian cycle as a result of the developments taking place in a very, very interesting way. So I think I won't go into the project, so I'll do it very quickly. So just to say that we've been working in that, this was a map that was in the 1967 plan, which showed what you really need to do is make a big highway from one end of the country to the other, that big dark blotch. And there would be there'd be major new urban centers in the northern parts of all our provinces. And in fact, the last 10 years have been working in 3 sites, the oil sands of Alberta, mining area in northern Thompson, and the Ring of Fire, all of which, if I spoke about those in Canada, they'd say those damn Indians stopped our development, not the oil prices, it was them, because they're gaining more and more power all the time. And in all these sites, we're dealing with the balancing, sort of rebalancing between their resources, the First Nations rights, and the rights of mining companies to come in here, which is a topic that is an area of work that we've had for 25 years in Africa, that very exercise. So there's really a kind of re-treaty making going on in these areas, and very much a kind of a re-survey, if I can call it that, of a kind of fourth layer that overlays these old layers and starts to structure life. And that, interesting enough, that fourth layer is not driven by native regional plans. It's also driven by the fact that forests and geology and resources are in the landscape. So there's a whole new, we're having a little revolution, I think, actually, a soft revolution that's going on. And as one of our great writers wrote not too long ago, he said, we're now a Métis nation. That is, we're mixed, is the term mestizo, or however you want to say it. And I think that the work that we're involved in is sort of Métis planning. How do we bring this together? And so briefly, that's it.
Great. Thank you very much, John. By pure coincidence, we have another comrade from the Commonwealth. Let us not remind it. We didn't plant that. It just happened by coincidence, but maybe we could dig into the Crown in some kind of manner, because the colonial discourse is not only bubbling up, but actually maybe prescient more than ever. We're going to be as Vaijayanti is just getting set up, I'll briefly introduce her. So I just remind everybody, as Vaijayanti's setting up, that we now have a new division for Google Inc. that's been proposed. We have a new Department of Cartography at the federal level, and now we have a plan by John Van Nostrand for the east-west part of North America. So as, yeah, we have a mega project in formation here. Vaijayanti Rao is director of the Terraform Center for Advanced Urban Research in New York. Prior to her appointment at Terraform, she held research and teaching positions at the New School, Yale University, University of Chicago, where she received her PhD in socio-cultural anthropology. From 2002 to 2005, she served as the co-director of PUCAR, Partners for Urban Knowledge, Action and Research, which was innovative urban think tank based in Mumbai. She's worked in and on cities after globalization, specifically on the intersection of urban planning, design, art, violence, and speculation in the articulation of the contemporary global city. She's also author of numerous articles. I'm just going to mention a few here. One of them, which I think allowed me to get to know Vaijayanti a little bit more, which has now taken on a number of variations, Slum as Theory. She's also produced Speculation Now, essays and artworks produced in partnership with Karen Kuoni, director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics, and graphic designer Prem, and I'm sorry, I'm going to try to get this right, Krishma Murthy, which was published by Duke University Press in 2015. She's also recently completed a manuscript titled Speculative City, Building Stories in a Global Mumbai. She's got two new projects that are currently in the works right now. The first on violence and urbanism, titled How to Read a Bomb, Urban Battlefields in the 21st Century. And the second, a collaborative book of maps, drawings, and writings considering the role of the slum in generating Mumbai's contemporary urban form. And that's titled 50 Ways to Game a City, Loophole Planning in Mumbai. Please welcome Vaijayanti Rao.
Thank you, Pierre, and to Alex and Ghazal for inviting me. At first I thought that I would just play a set of images in the background while I spoke, but I think I've changed the plan a little bit. I think that seems appropriate in light of what we're discussing as well. So what I try to do is speak to you from my research in Mumbai, and then go through the images very quickly. So try to imagine what I'm speaking about. But we'll have this map of Mumbai in the background because in fact, it's a site. It's a map of the sites of investigation that have taken me back and forth between Mumbai and the United States for the last decade or so. So for the last 25 years, Mumbai, the object of my research, has been growing rapidly and vertically. For the last decade or so, I've followed this transformation obsessively and forensically, trying to document the ways in which space has been recoded, how territories have come to be infused with value, and to investigate the design of infrastructures that organize and manage the city as a life world. From a city in which infrastructure and infra spaces provided a spine for an architecture and that made space for the city's toilers, its marginalized labor force, new spaces of operation are emerging through speculation and counter-speculation. While practices of counter-speculation play with the invisible compositional forces that manifest themselves physically in the space of the city, powerful actors speculate on how to narrow the gap between norms, forms, and values to control the volatile conditions that both provide the grounds for speculation and in their wake generate ever greater uncertainty and ever more volatile forms of infrastructure. In its more common understanding, speculation is a practice of placing bets on the direction of change. For those with power to change things and to influence its direction, the control of that information yields outsized profits, chiefly by controlling volatility. For those who become the objects and targets of such power, speculation is all about changing the terms of operation, of practices that will push back control, recode space with new information, and yield new spaces of operation. Put another way, spatial tractability has become the subject of continuous contestation, and the city that emerges is, as to quote Sanford Quinter, a perpetually organizing field of forces in movement. My question, so to speak, is how do people inhabit this field of forces? What forms of knowledge do they bring to it? That knowledge, it turns out, has a lot to do with knowing the codes, but it also turns out that knowing the codes may amount to not knowing at all, or rather to strategically anticipating with all of one's resources. In this decade-long journey through the city of Mumbai, I've met tens, perhaps hundreds of people, and asked them all the same question. What do you think is happening? What do you think will happen? Some are more active than others, some have more information, others less. But each has a story. The city is a story, a fiction, an atmosphere thick with speculations, with an understanding that one does not know and yet one must act. And so one must construct a relationship between two questions. What if I do this? And what next? Or where will this lead? So that relationship between the what if and what next is pretty central to these stories. So Santosh, who lives in a settlement next to the municipal landfill in northeastern Mumbai, said to me in a conversation that mapping where people live tells you how they came to the city. Those in his settlement had arrived suddenly, escaping severe drought in their villages in the early 1970s. So they settled anywhere at all, occupying the interstitial spaces on the side of the road, beside a train track, or next to a drain. Like the beans on an uprooted vine, which is a metaphor offered by Daya Pawar, a powerful writer from the Dalit, or the formerly untouchable community that Santosh belongs to, they lined these spaces without ever settling in. So if the city is a story, then what's the plot? And I decided to try to make a linear plot out of this. Impossible, of course. So our city story begins with an ineffective development plan enshrining a host of restrictive regulations, chiefly a Rent Control Act freezing rents at 1948 rates that restricted the development of rental housing, an Urban Land Ceiling Act restricting individual ownership to 5,000 square meters of urban property, and a uniform ceiling on the floor space index, as it's called in Mumbai, or FAR, as it's more popularly known here, across the island city and its extensions northwards along its eastern and western waterfronts. So as you'll see, many of these sites are following that FAR restriction, as it were. As the city grows and swells with waves of migrations of impoverished immigrants from the countryside and of aspiring middle classes, these codes interact with each other, squeezing, pushing, spilling, producing an excess. An infracity begins to emerge. From the beginning, it provides an image, a spectacle mocking architecture. Then slowly another city takes root, and then another, one that scales up that settlement's impact and its ability to affect the rest of the code, an infra-city. But we'll come to that a bit later. Let us note that we call that infra-city slum for short, and in Mumbai we recognize some of these cities, we entitle them and regularize them, however partially, following a law passed in 1971 to govern slum areas and their residents. How did this happen? Joseph Bain D'Souza, a senior bureaucrat and once Mumbai's municipal commissioner, had this to offer in analyzing the city's second development plan, which was drafted in the waning years of the nation's commitment to an autarkic socialism that explicitly promoted rural development even in the face of rapid migration to the cities. And I'll quote from D'Souza's paper, which was published in 1991. And he says, the function of the development plan was to promote and sustain Bombay's economic growth, Bombay as it was then called, and to raise the quality of our citizens' lives. The two were closely bound together. So it was necessary to promote additional employment in the city instead of trying to inhibit it. In elitist fervor, the plan prescribed built-up area to plot area ratios called floor space indices in Bombay and maximum densities, which took most of the housing built in the city out of the reach of the lower middle class and poor people. private developers were in any case not interested for building for these groups of people because there was enough demand from upper class people to absorb all their product at prices artificially inflated because of the ceiling law. To counter this disinclination, we suggested a housing density of at least 325 units per hectare in several tracts of the city. We proposed a 20% FSI bonus if the density were to reach 450. As the head of a committee that had been appointed to investigate the plan, which had been prepared by the municipal corporation, D'Souza and his fellow committee members took the opportunity to point out that no plan could ignore the inexorable growth of a city like Mumbai, even back then a vibrant hub of economic activity, a city where planned limits to growth were bound to fail. As this development plan came into effect, the old autarkic order of the Cold War era collapsed. India liberalized its economy, anticipating a political order which was governed by the abstract concerns of its economy, servicing its foreign debt, opening its doors to foreign investors, and finally entering market society, an economy that some have described as being based finally on the potentiality of capital and organizing social life itself around economic activity. In his historical studies of liberalism, Michel Foucault observes that with the rise of liberalism, the market finally becomes the site of truth, calibrating and pricing the interests and desires of autonomous individuals through market exchanges. Between the development plan's incentives offering bonus development rights to private parties for resettling the residents of neglected and dilapidated buildings, slums, and other occupants of lands needed for public amenities and large-scale infrastructure projects, and the stated intent of the incentives to mass-produce social housing with little cost to the state, and the growing demand for real estate products from all sections and classes, a new land market emerged. One that depended fundamentally on displacing the infracity, on adjusting settlements and recoding space. As infracities came to embody displaced economies and displaceable citizens, the quotidian urbanism of these cities within came to be closely tied to the management of the slippery, information-rich, networked environments that proliferate in these settlements through various practices of infrastructure making at different scales. No good story is complete without a ghost. And thanks to Pierre, ghost comes in. These new verticals are the dinosaurs of our times, are but speculative fictions. They're built on dreams and aspirations of so many. They sometimes remain vacant as development potential has far exceeded any realistic absorption capacity. I once brought up speculation with a young real estate financier in Bombay and asked him what it meant, what he thought it meant. He had traveled the world to find money, he said, to invest the savings of Canadian teachers, American nurses, and Indian professionals in the Emirates, and spun fictions about the hunger of Indians for good quality architectural products. But in the end, he said there was no end user, at least not one whom he had met. Money whizzed through empty shells, rooms and corridors, in through one door and out through the other and in again. The investment company produced its charts and mapped the potential for finding land, spinning gold, especially out of the slums, which he said were beautiful because there was no down payment in hard currency required. The down payment was made by selling dreams to slum dwellers, getting them to move, and then slowly dripping bits of money to prepare the site for the next giant shell, while the rest of the money, the savings of teachers, nurses, and salaried professionals, was free to flow elsewhere, gathering speed and value. But here comes the ghost in the code. The displaced mill worker, squeezed into a 20-square-meter allotment, wanders his old streets insistently. He asks, what happened to the good city where he could walk to work, his children to school, his old mother to the doctor, and his friends to meet him in the park? What happened to that place which they never had to leave but was still open to the excitement of encounter, to the frisson of the rest of the city? That was the question that Datta Iswalkar, a prominent activist, asked me as we walked through Mumbai's erstwhile textile mill district, a hub that housed 250,000 people before its rampant redevelopment began sometime in the 1990s. Wandering through this vertiginous schizophrenic district that new rules have recoded as pure fiscal matter, we asked what turn the story would take next. The ghosts of spaces past are still fresh and intrude insistently, lurking in the shadows cast by these vertical giants. Chasing these ghosts, tracking them down across the city, I ran into another man in another infra-city, infamous for being Asia's largest slum, known as Dharavi. In reality, Dharavi is a vast factory, the hive of activity that the planner bureaucrat alluded to before. Here, in a plastic recycling factory, or workshop, to put it more accurately, a man named Thambi kept butting into a conversation I was having with his boss and childhood friend, a formidable lady named Hanumanti. The redevelopment of Dharavi has been imminent for the last 10 years, since its 550 acres were declared a special planning zone. More than 100,000 people were legally entitled to be resettled in allotments ranging from 225 to 400 square feet in size, depending on who you spoke to and when. So, what did you think of the future, I asked. What if Dharavi is really redeveloped? What next? Thambi just butted in and took over the next 3 minutes. What future? What future? I'm sick of hearing about all this, he said. For 52 years, I've been waiting for the ground to slip away beneath my feet. I've been waiting, and now I really don't know what's happening, he said. Sure that it would slip away, he was in fact surprised to find that he had grown old in Dharavi, never thinking of a future which was an impossible abstraction for him. Now he was really confused. But he was also somehow sure that the ground beneath his feet would slip away, everything would go under, the sea would crash into the land, they would become one. How could you tell? I asked. Well, the ocean has already come down a bit. It still hasn't crashed into us yet, because something remains to come down from the skies, he said. Now, even more confused by his images of land, sea, and sky, Hanumanti and the others in her workshop, as well as myself, asked him again, what will come down? What might happen? There's a whirlwind, he said, a tornado in the sky. It's waiting somewhere. We don't know where. I'm no scientist. I'm just an old drunk. But I'm telling you, it will come down, and then the land will be pressed underground, disappear into subterranean depths. To humor him, Hanumanti's husband said, let's build an airport for it to land then. He, the storm, won't land in the airport, Thambi said. He won't land there. He'll look for a basti, a settlement full of life and land in its midst. We all stopped laughing. I recounted this story to my friend Jamila, a powerful housing rights activist who lived across town in another locality that had been repeatedly threatened with demolition. A very bad monsoon had just ended. There was no water in the lakes that supplied Mumbai. Jamila's locality was not yet regularized into the municipal service system and dependent on abundant water trickling down to the few taps that they had managed to squeeze by putting moral pressure on the local politicians. In a flash, she connected Thambi's story of the storm to their own struggles with renewing the meaning of nature and its power to level, to be a common thread in the weave of a politics of life itself, because her locality had been built after the cutoff date deemed by the state as the line that would not be crossed for providing services or resettlement in the incentivized private resettlement developments. They were being cut off from municipal water altogether because of the drought, or the bad monsoon rather. You tell me, she asked, does nature have a cutoff date? Can we be cut off from life? She struggled against this injustice, this attempt to enclose and exclude her fellow occupiers from the land they had painstakingly made by using construction debris and mud and earth brought from elsewhere, and from the water that was God-given. The struggle of the infra-city is to create new spaces of operation. to scale up and beyond the limits that the city of fictitious capital continues to impose on it. A reminder that Marx discussed fictitious capital, a reminder here that Marx discussed fictitious capital as the offspring of interest-bearing capital, the mother of all insane forms, as he called it in Capital Volume 3. In this mad proliferation of space, the speculative city is a connective fiction that joins the infracity to the city of planners, the vertical city to the displaced citizen. A wandering ghost who fiercely occupies a sliver of land, speculating with her life itself for a life lived in common with others, a nonviolent agonism that desires the right to participate in coding and recoding, programming and reprogramming, building and living to tell the story. One way to do this was to build connections between these sprawling fragments, turbulent, volatile spaces where speculations and counter-speculations extend temporal horizons as they accidentally did for the drunken old Thambi, where material worlds meet virtual worlds, where heterogeneous practices of placemaking encounter and mix freely. To tell the story is to retain some of the spirit of the schizophrenic, holding many different possibilities simultaneously in view. For that is the story of the speculative city, a space of excessive connections where all attempts to narrow down choices lead to the emergence of new networks, where no redemption is possible, only creative agonism. So now let's move to the images that may actually make some of this, these stories more visible. I've deliberately avoided putting the people in the pictures. I've always had this kind of sense of I should protect some identities. But that may be a...
So that's very different than the way that architects take people out of their buildings, right?
Right.
Very, very different reasons.
Absolutely.
One aesthetic, one political.
But yeah, I mean, it's really the first presentation I've given where I've named people and told their stories so openly. But so what you will see is a kind of a process of curating a huge number of images, and I sort of feel like, you know, the people that Bobby spoke about showed the photographs and then tried to categorize and try to tell a linear story from this catalog, but that can only happen with every curation, and this is a particular curation that sort of parallels the story that I was trying to tell. So we'll begin with what Mumbai probably looked like almost till the middle of the 1990s, with the infraspace settlement of people who were explicitly excluded from the code being the second development plan that was articulated around limits, around planned limits to growth. So here, I mean, this kind of settlement still goes on: pylons, railway tracks, edges, various kinds. And the process of inclusion into the code produces a kind of an algorithm that sort of goes as follows. Now, this image is sort of cut off, but you take an existing form that will be redeveloped. You resettle the tenants or the slum dwellers or the occupiers of the space by allotting each family a standard-sized allotment. And the figure was 225 square feet. It was a magical figure. And then you provide an incentive to the private developer who undertakes the kind of architectural work, as it were. And this actually is produced, now it's been systematically studied. It's actually made the code visible rather than invisible in very interesting and material ways. So what this has produced is, and people have been systematically following this, the formula of split should have been 60% to the original occupiers and 40% to the builder or the private developer for sale, but instead it's the reverse. So if you actually, and there are now very good studies that look at the numbers and show this. So here's a diagram, and I should say also that some of this work has been done in collaboration with Vineet Divadkar, recent graduate of the GST, who has similarly and obsessively followed my material on Mumbai and tried to represent it in a style that's more accessible, or a kind of narrative form, I should say, of maps and drawings and diagrams. And some of these have sort of really come out of my saying to Vineet, listen, I mean, this is, here's a set of restrictive regulations, the Land Ceiling Act, the Uniform FAR, and these acts that you see on the right that are legal codes that actually were designed to restrict growth. And then there were these loophole regulations that were proposed by the committee headed by Joseph Bain de Souza in order to produce social housing, in fact, in order to house those excluded by those restricted regulations. That was the intention. But what they've produced are incredible volatility and forms that you will now see in the subsequent. This again, apologies for the cutoff, but these are maps that are prepared by real estate developers, real estate investment offices that kind of gauge the potential of redevelopable land. So it's no longer development land, but it's actually really land that's fit for redevelopment. This one, again, cut off, but we can look at the images if you're interested. But this one, again, also produced by the same real estate firm that looks at the amount of land occupied by slums, very small, 42 square kilometers, just about 10%. And that generates a development potential of even their own figures say 5 times the annual absorption capacity in Mumbai. So in fact, it overcapacitates the city, but with a certain kind of product. And here is the process in its kind of actual on the ground manifestation. So it involves coding buildings as dangerous, and then and in fact, in Hindi, the direct translation of this actually says, "This building will betray you." So it's not a dangerous building, but caution: do not live in this building, not fit for habitation. But of course, and then this is a kind of an attempt to diagram the whole process of redevelopment that in fact turns both people into a form of currency and also spatial allotments as a kind of floating currency, in turn giving rise to more potential for development. And here is a site being prepared for redevelopment. So this is in the very kind of dense old city of Mumbai. So you can see that the plots are, kind of 18th, 19th century plots. And in order to consume the development potential on that site that would emerge from resettling the tenants who occupy the site and adding potential, you will get, this is a transit accommodation that people are moved into while redevelopment is taking place. But what you will get is that sort of juxtaposition of forms as the landscape is in process. So in this image, in fact, you see, which is at the edge, it's taken from the top of the main landfill in Mumbai that I referred to in the paper. You see the whole process of harvesting at work. And then you have these hybrid forms where the slum resettlement component is combined with a commercial component in the same building envelope. Very clear kind of qualitative difference in order to consume the bonus FSI in situ. So there are rules and regulations. Every plot that has been recoded for redevelopment or been reassigned has to follow its particular logic. So Dharavi, for instance, which is a very large 550-acre settlement, gets a special planning zone designation, which means that you will not see these sorts of forms, but you'll see something else. But in this case, it was a small slum on a particular on that plot, and FSI had to be consumed at that site. You also get this kind of redevelopment, which is you have a plot that's large enough to accommodate the slum dwellers and the commercial development side by side. And again, you get this kind of outrageous but somewhat ludic, juxtaposition. And then here you have, and I don't mean ludic in the kind of sense of humor, but rather in the sense of, the slapstick kind of juxtaposition of completely outrageous side by side. And then here is the logo of the Slum Redevelopment Authority, which you begin to see more and more prominently on buildings in Mumbai. And these are some other types of resettlement apparatuses, if you like. They're large townships where the normal building codes of Mumbai no longer apply. But they're these large brownfield sites that have been, whose owners have been offered transferable development rights in lieu of giving them up for these colonies. And this is Hanumanti. This is her workshop in Dharavi. So this set of images will show you what we mean by the infra-city. And these are some very old images now from the early 90s, actually, of textile mills as they were being shut down. And these are tenement housing typically occupied by the textile mill workers, the ghosts of my story in some sense. Again, in anticipation, you have the renovation of interiors of these tenement houses that look like this, that have already kind of started to be, space has already been recoded in some sense from the inside in these ways. And then, and these are some new housing that have been provided to these displaced mill workers that have come out of these resettlement, redevelopment codes. So this is where they were, and this is where some of them have been resettled. Again, this set of images goes back to the infra-cities, more typical of like consolidated settlements that have existed at least for 20, 25 years as this process of redevelopment is happening, with many kind of fixes for infrastructure. This is and this is one image that I've been following for about a decade. This picture was taken in 2005 of a community center that was very, very tentatively, in a sense, a proposal at that time for the children of the area next to the dumping ground, next to the landfill, where many of their parents worked as rag pickers. And this is what it has become in 2014. So a decade has passed from that proposal to what it is now. And here's the kind of workspace adjacent to the landfill itself. And this is my friend Jamila, who in fact proposed to me that the way that the city is formed is precisely through connections. And one afternoon when I was leaving her house, she caught me looking at her hands, and she said, "I think I know what you're thinking, and this is how I will connect to you." And she offered me the gift of the henna tattoos. And that, in fact, yes, that was what I was thinking. And I leave you with these images of, this in particular, highly dramatic, that makes you really look at the process on the ground. The blue tops are the slums, the low-rise, really dense concentrations in front of the high-rise buildings are the resettlement housing for those people whom the high-rises have displaced. And no doubt these blue tops will also be gone soon. And here is an attempt to kind of go back and diagram this process. In more ways, I mean, even more obsessively than I've done. These are Vinit's models of one particular site that has been redeveloped, and again, these models, the earlier models, the sequence of 4 images. Earlier images are taken from, obviously, from re-rendering Google Earth images of the site. So 2004, 2005, that site is occupied. 2007, and this is what it is today. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vaijayanti. Always reminded when you present how good of a both storyteller and narrator you are. If only, I wish I could present without slides sometimes, although you did a great job afterwards. I wish I could speak that way and tell these stories in the same way. So we are running, of course, I mean, given our tradition of running overtime, we're following suit with that. But I think it'd be really nice if Alex and Ghazal will allow us to take, 15 or 20 minutes. I thought it'd be really nice to a certain extent, reconvene over a number of issues that have come up, but also to keep the conversation very pointed. It'd be really nice to be projective in terms of either looking at unfinished projects or in terms of being projective, in terms of understanding what projects could we look at, not actually in the distant future, but actually what we could operationalize and work on now. So I'm going to come around to that in a second. What I would like to do, if this is okay as well, Ghazal, Alex, is put a name with a face without subverting the longer introductions today, just for those who are joining us here. Alex and Ghazal, of course, who are organizing the conference, Catalyst, Muro here from the GSD, Bill Anderson from AECOM, Liz Falletta from USC, John Van Nostren here, Deborah Meza from Assembly, I'm sorry, Stephen Moore from the Bartlett, Bobby's here to my side, Benjamin Bratton, and of course we just heard from Vaijayanti. There's been a number of what I find particularly interesting, just as a kind of a very brief sum up, I find it particularly interesting that are very core structures that are being put into question in each one of the presentations. And whether or not it is a settlement strategy and also an Indian Act from the 19th century, or whether or not it's a master plan from the 1960s that was put into place as a kind of frame, whether or not it was technique, technology, methods of instrumentation from the early 1960s, or even at the same time, codes that are being put into place. And I'm simply gonna plagiarize you here, Benjamin, in terms of the potential for software to subvert, to a certain extent, the surface of the state itself. There's elements of subversion here, but also at the same time, what I see moving forward in a discourse is that we're beyond this idea of hacking into systems as if we're just kind of like off to the side, which has been somewhat reoccurrent over the past few years in terms of discussions about the role of designers. I'm actually happily optimistic about the fact that you're proposing projects that require the mobilization of levels of knowledge, but in order to do that, we need to truly understand what we're operating on, and in order to do that, we need to look at these fixed protocols that are in fact conditioning environments today. And what I find particularly interesting is twofold, is the fact that these are structures that are not part of, let's say, a current neoliberal or capitalist era. What I find particularly interesting is that they're being backdated to past eras, which I don't think is by mistake past colonial eras. What I think is particularly interesting is that it necessarily takes us both in, across, through, much beyond the city itself in terms of opening up territories and extra territories. It does, yes, on a third level, puts into question the issue of boundaries and borders. But what I'd like to do is given the fact that you've all done an extremely sort of like pointed surgical job in terms of understanding how there are exclusions, how there are transfers of knowledge that are very particular between, let's say, the 10-inch vision between eye to image, the role of the skin. I'm wondering how could we, if you could just comment and jump in terms of what do you see as being the project now? What knowledge do we not have enough of in order to start understanding how to be able to intervene? I find, the reason why I ask that, and I know I'm taking you to task here, is John mentioned this idea of a soft revolution underway, and I actually want to underscore that. I think it's actually a very, very significant territorial revolution that's occurring at the moment. I think it's largely dominated by one single, to invoke Erica Violet Lee's quote on the Anthropocene, the kind of like Eurocentric buzzword of the Anthropocene. And I see opening up vast, both territories of understanding and representation, but also of intervention and transformation. And what I find exciting is that it invokes citizenship, it invokes people that have been excluded, and the kind of distribution of power. And I'm just wondering, if there was a project to undertake, if there's knowledge that we do not have, if there's a map that's not drawn, what is the information, what is the skills, even techniques, even instrumentation that we need in order to engage in that particular project? Given the fact that you're working also in different parts of the world, but to a certain extent, whether or not it's the survey grid or the process of surveying, which I think is adaptable to practically every projects that are presented here, be interesting to both speculate, but also to try to understand what could be done now. Is that too big? And the idea here is that it opens up also the whole table here, so.
Can I start?
Yeah, jump in, please.
So, I mean, I think the key that you say, your key question, as I hear it, is what knowledge do we not have? And then you followed up by saying, in order to intervene, which I think is pretty key to me. And that's why I included these last images, because I do think that there is a point to this kind of obsessive diagramming of the processes. And that's precisely to kind of chart a way to intervene. And in some sense, that makes me the maverick in my field, you know, where I can't just sort of say it's okay to be critical and analytical and then talk about Foucault and all the processes that we're being, you know, or understanding those processes. But what I find in common, I think, with what Benjamin and Bobby and John as well, the work was showing was that where we are today is a moment where there's a constant flipping between being included and being excluded. And that moment has no historicity as such. I mean, it's kind of, you know, a moment of terrible fear, precisely because you never know when that switch will happen. And, you know, following some of these stories, one of the things that became very clear to me is that, you know, it's not that the people that I was interviewing or in conversation with who lived in these situations didn't have aspirations, or that their politics was a revolutionary one, you know, or that their desire was to overturn the system. On the contrary, it was actually to kind of make an impact, to sort of scale up what they saw as their contribution, and to find the right tools to do so. And those tools not necessarily, you know, involve people being coded as, or taking on the mantle of subjectivity of the poor, for example. If being, you know, being kind of coded with this whole notion of being the recipient of ameliorative assistance.
I think it's really apt that this idea that, in fact, to the very first points that got us started in terms of rethinking the very language that in itself actually both categorizes and codes environments in which we're in. And I think you're also reminding us, I think, of a number of projects that, in fact, perhaps the intervention is actually not only diverting the intervention, but understanding that the very project of unmapping is also potentially a very, very powerful one. I mean, I'm wondering whether or not that necessarily leads to the idea of weaker states. That I don't know, but it'd be interesting to hear others.
Can I use it?
Please.
This is fitting. It's a news conference or something, you know. Yeah, on the states is an interesting question. I think it actually ties up with a lot of what we're thinking about here. My first reaction to your to what you're saying, it has to do with I guess the notion of with, as I talk about with exception, and as we're talking about here as well, it's exceptionality of the emergence of emergency. Yeah? One way in which Anthropocene, I think the useful term, I mean, one of the ways, there's other reasons why I think it's it has some usefulness, is a sense of an emergency, which can be taken at least a few ways in terms of design's own reaction to this. One being there is this crisis moment, and all the design, there is no future, there's only here and now, and we need to design entirely in the image of this crisis, which oftentimes has the effect of normalizing this crisis as this goes forward. Like whatever becomes this most provisional state, like the security lines at an airport, it's sort of it becomes a sort of the ways in which this gets normalized. The other connotation is to design with the emergence, exactly what is in fact coming on the other side of this. And I think there's an ethics to this that's important to hold on to. One thing that Bobby and I were talking about over the break was there's a term in the book that I use called geoscapes, which is a sort of a riff on Ajahn Potterai's mediascapes, finance-scapes, and the thing that is that there's a space in which multiple competing geographies interoperate. That there's a sort of compete for the right to describe the space in the first place. And so there's this space of spaces, in a way, or geography of geographies, that isn't an empty space that gets filled up with things, but is made by all of those claims over it at the same time. Yeah? And so what strikes us perhaps today is so sort of weird about the descriptive project of just a few years ago was the idea that there has to be one mechanism by which this space would be described, and that any kind of variations in this is an exception that needs to be scrubbed out of it some sort of way as well, right? Now with Google Earth and as many KML layers as you want, you can redescribe this over and over and over. And so I think there's this proliferation of multiple and competing geographic descriptions of the same site, the same system, the same condition, the same now, may have been an exceptional condition, and has been an exceptional condition for much of modernity, perhaps at a time where information and data was a scarce resource and needed to be coaxed out of the world and gardened in a very particular way. And now perhaps the opposite problem is this way as well. And so part of the question of what knowledge do we need in order to go forward with this as well may be rephrased as, what do we do with how do we do with the knowledges that we have, right, in this plurality and this multiplicity, with an understanding that they'll never, nor should they ever somehow resolve into some kind of consensual order, but that agonistic logic of them is in a way, to a certain extent, less of the exceptional schizo condition that it might have been, and it's now in a way a kind of new normative. Right? It's less about hacking these systems and an understanding that to a certain degree, for better and worse, that these normative systems operate along those lines to begin with in a certain way. Just a couple quick thoughts then on this, if I might. One has to do with the nature of the maps and the models with which to work, and it's very easy in looking at these. the privilege of watching these amazing presentations, it's interesting to understand where certain maps that may look graphically very similar may in certain senses have been meant to be essentially descriptive at a time, whereas other ones where speculative maps may have been essentially predictive, trying to sort of model what might happen, and then other ones were projective, where they're trying to map something that might in fact happen as a preferred outcome, as a different kind of speculation, right? And it's quite how easily they will slide between one another, where something that's descriptive becomes predictive, predictive becomes projective, or vice versa in these sorts of ways as well. And then the last, just the sort of, I guess, the sort of thing to put on with the states, and it is that on the one hand, and I think I try to make this argument that one of the interesting, I think, the geopolitical shifts of our time is that things that we used to ask of the modern state, cartography. We were talking about the Nicaragua, Costa Rica anomaly with Google Maps, where they moved the line from one to the other, right? Things that we used to ask of states, we ask of cloud platforms are performing, ID, currency, other sorts of things, for better or worse. But at the same time, the inverse is also true, where states are becoming themselves cloud platforms, whether we see with Snowden and the rest of this. And there's this sort of convergence and cross-speciation between these two institutional models. But what I think will remain, or what we should hope to remain, is this multiplication of these totalities, right? It's not that there is one totality that might supervise all of these things that compete against the other, and therefore the goal is to undermine that totality always, to continuously deterritorialize the totality. What we have is a situation of the multiplication of multiple totalities, one on top of another, none of which, each of which is according to its own logic and internally consistent description, but none of which has a totality on totalities itself, which I think shifts the terms of how we design and intervene in this in some different ways. And then the last point I wanted to which I think goes with this, is one of the things I've gotten very interested in around this machine vision interest, but also I think the cartography and the description and Bowker and Lee and the categorization logic are forms of we could call algorithmic apophenia, like ways in which, like the Google Deep Dream machine vision thing, where it hallucinates dogs and everything, is kind of an example of this as well. But there's ways in which that untrained observer and categorizer of those systems, who doesn't have those preconceived notions, might see this image field in particular kinds of ways, and might describe it according to those kinds of those sorts of dispositions that someone else might take to be a category error, a pattern recognition error, where they saw something as something else. There's also ways in which those kinds of descriptions, I think, both of your, and actually all of these presentations made clear, are actually generative of those new conceptual categories. They're the sites where those kinds of things actually emerge in the first place, and so we should be respectful of apophenia and error in this way, right? And so, like, as I've said, Virilio's axiom of any new technology produces a new accident, the inverse is also true, that any new accident produces a new technology. Anyway.
Yeah,
level of are we ready? I'd say we are. I'm sorry.
Use the mic.
Just the
Use the
microphone.
mic. Just your question about are we ready to change, to work on this or move to the next stage or get projects. I had a professor, I guess the best professor I ever had. He called it, all his exercises, or many of them, he called think and jump. He had to think, but you also had to jump into so what does it mean on the ground, and how can you do it? And I think one of the aspects I'm getting out of this is there's a lack of, its research is so critical, it's so hard to do, it takes so long, it's hard to do that and do it. It's a classic discussion I've already had here with 2 or 3 people about how do you practice, and what's the relationship between practice and academic work? And I somehow think there must be some model for, without brainwashing students into the way, there must be some model here for linking the two, because certainly you've had this experience of really for 35 years working simultaneously in Africa on squatting and in Toronto on housing issues. And we've just had the time there to talk and understand, and we'll have typically 40 meetings there with an affected party, all-day meetings, and we get 3 if we're lucky in Toronto with that same group. So this, I don't know how I think, so I think you've got to do things because you learn how to think about them then. If you don't do them, you know, you just, well, you get trapped. But also I think there has to be some union between people who think a lot more than the doers, or thinkers and doers have to get together. Because I think they've been split up. And that's to the advantage of power, really.
And I was going to, kind of similarly, when you were asking what's missing, what struck me, and I think we're talking about different contexts and eras too, but what struck me that was missing pretty blatantly was the public and their values, and then being able to have a process for realizing those values into the design process. They'll speak if asked, but was there really a way to incorporate it? When they were asked, they had some wise thoughts that informed the design process. So, and nowadays, well, in the past, you had to deal with governmental institutions or formal institutions in order to be heard, and a large segment of the populace couldn't access those institutions because of discrimination or means, or they're too busy trying to survive. But now more and more, I think, because of technology, people are going to the public directly. They're bypassing the middleman, the government, and or the developer or the architect, and so if we don't learn how to engage those folks directly into the design process and inform them about design in that process. Your other question about the state, the role of the state in the future, I think that's what will put it at risk. This presidential election is kind of an example of that. Two prominent candidates are going straight to the public, not through the party apparatus. And so I think, and that's playing out very much in the local level of planning and implementation, so around the country.
No, that's great. Pass it on to
Oh, I actually want to connect kind of two thoughts that I've been having just listening to everyone speak. I think your last point, they will speak when asked, is an interesting point, because speak when asked suggests that input from the community is just another data input to a particular organizational form of interpretation, versus the community themselves proposing an alternative institutional form for processing the same information that these kind of more entrenched institutions are doing the same type of work. And it kind of gets to Benjamin's point of geography of geographies, right? These competing institutional views on how to parcel up the ground, what categories are important, how to make them mutually exclusive and comprehensive. And I think, for me, I'm glad to actually hear that come up in the conversation, because latent in my paper was just a sort of being excited for that possibility that the treating the organizational form of the work as a precondition, as the a priori that shapes the experience of the interpreter, the conventional or banal set of categories that they might be thinking through can be opened up simply by allowing themselves to go through this the kind of overriding organizational form. And so a radical practice might be proposing as a collective new ways of doing work for processing information, where you give yourself constraints so you can't think through things in the way you normally would. And I think there's a real potential in imagining data not as a project of transparency or of illuminating, but it's actually in its density and in its techniques, a new form of opacity. It's actually an architectural material that can create closure, that any type of representation, its correspondence to the thing that it represents, there is one path that leads it back to that item, but it also produces an infinity of ghosts. That any one thing that you're talking about, when it goes through the abstraction process of becoming data, can also correspond to numerous other things. And it's up to the public to kind of take advantage of that multiplicity of associations between something that's been called a particular class of things, a type, and what it actually is out in the world.
No, I think it's a really nice point. I also want to bring up that very clearly the conversation of multiple publics and the emergence of many other voices. I would, if I can mention here, there is a caution in this kind of consideration, given the fact that ultimately the ownership of land is particularly important. The case of the U.S., I would actually argue, is exceptional to the world because of divisions of powers, which is built into the Constitution, whereas nation states around the world is exactly the opposite. I would actually still argue that that ultimately this relationship between power and land, which, to use exactly the same word, a priori, is important to kind of like understand this relationship between law and land and the map right at the middle. And that ultimately, I think the agency of the map to be able to understand what questions we need to ask of the map, of the representation, of the projection, of the data becomes particularly important, because I think if there's any revolution, if there's a revolution of bypassing, let's say, the middle white man of bureaucracy in the middle of the state, what I think is particularly interesting is that you actually can't do that in other places, in where, for example, in Canada, the largest landholder in the world, 95% of land is owned by the Crown. And what's dangerous is that Canada is exporting, as a matter of foreign policy, that model. So it's going exactly in the opposite direction. And I think what's interesting is that it does place the question of information. How is it gathered? Who gathers it? Who funds it? What is considered to be information or excluded? How we bundle that information as well, and how it's distributed. I mean, I'm comforted by the fact that just simply the more information and the better the distribution of it, that we could be fighting for the distribution of that information as a way to become much more critical and essentially unlock more agency. Deborah, did you have a point that you wanted to make?
Actually been very recently there is a lot of information people writing about the physical and the emotional realities of these contexts. I think it's, in the end, what matters when it comes to building these contexts, and when the practitioners have to really design this context, what information does matter. And typically the information that matters to the property owner or the developer is not the modes of life of the people that are relocated, or the way these lands have been operating in the past. No? And typically there's a tabula rasa situation where realities are completely simplified. And there is information about how these slums are really very productive urban tissues, and a lot of things can be learned from the way people live in there. Probably, and of course, the physical reality, there's no infrastructure because there's not an interest to allow these people to grow, because that is a stock market for future developments. But certainly, the way these people are relocated is not really understanding where they are coming from, and they come from this horizontal urbanism, where they have their homes and their business together, and suddenly they're relocated in towers where they cannot continue these modes of life. So I think design can solve that, but there has to be some policies, some coding that will allow this information to get into the system and allow designers and developers to use it appropriately.
No, that's great. Stephen or Liz or John?
This has really been a fun conversation because the way I watched the conversation move around the room in this direction, it went from a view that I'll call respectfully mildly technologically deterministic. In other words, the concern is that the very nature of the technology determines the conversation about land use and who gets to decide. And by the time we got to John, who I think has done a lot of advocacy work, especially with First Nations, the question becomes, well, what we don't know is in fact the way that people on the map, like right there, would like to live. What do they think about, what do they know about their own condition, and how would they like to change that? So just as the technology is capable of becoming opaque and deterministic, it also has the capacity to advocate for the agency of that guy right there. So I would maybe suggest in the afternoon we could talk more about where does agency lie within the systems that we're creating. In fact, in the end, we are the creators of the technologies. Sometimes they create themselves in opaque, stacks, but there is the opportunity, I think, for people to speak on their own behalf that's made by the technologies.
Yeah, go for it.
Yes. I think that part of maybe to extend this, I think maybe to where I got to your point is how does agency, what is the condition by which agency is mediated such that it can scale, so that it can have a traction that would able to produce durable urban scale gestures larger than the ones it does at the scale of the anthropometric man on the corner. And I think in your point about the theory and practice, I mean, from the theory side, I just want to say, parenthetically, I think that right now the technical capacities far outpace our conceptual ones at this point. And I think this relationship between sorry, I'm molesting your pencil. Traditional relationship between, we read the theory and then apply it to the design, I think in many ways, we're in a position where it needs to be inverted in much in this sort of state as well. But I think one thing that sort of keep in mind is there's a means and ends issue here that's sometimes maybe a bit counterintuitive, and that we may sort of assume, for reasonable reason, that if we want to have outcomes that are non-hierarchical, egalitarian, democratic, and so forth and so on, that thereby the means by which we would arrive at those outcomes need to be, then in themselves, methodologically non-hierarchical, democratic, and non-hierarchical, which is what Nick Charnashek and Alex Williams called prefigurative politics. And so that if we do this, and somehow the ends don't work out the way we want, the tendency is to then attempt to purify the means more so. There needs to be, those means need to be policed further in certain sorts of way. And so, by all means, the voice and participation of publics, whether that's, I don't know whether that may be a different word, but I don't know how it'd be part of it. But the idea that it essentially, again, that I think that by trying to model those means on the outcomes in a certain sort of way doesn't always work. I mean, your presentation, in particular on the grid, was totally fascinating to me, because I think grids are a way in which, something that design knows that sometimes politics doesn't know, is that sometimes to have the most democratic, egalitarian, non-hierarchical, fluid, dynamic, sort of rich urban outcome, the superimposition of a dumb, inflexible, autocratic type topology onto the system is sometimes the way in which that happens, as it does with the urban grid as a sort of canonical platform model. And so sometimes not only is the means and ends not correspondent, they're sometimes totally inverted in terms of those logics.
I think I just want to say what I'm talking about is just talking.
Yes, with no doubt.
Conversation.
Of course.
So I'd say,
Yeah.
no, I really,
Yeah, yeah.
we have, we entered the world of mining. Our basic work overseas has been with squatters, and definitely we learned the lesson of, they all had a plan. They all have an idea of their house and what they want. And,
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
But you had to converse to I learned that. I mean, I didn't from them, and we got into the mining field and the whole question of resettlement of people, and decided to enter into it on the basis that we were mediators between the mining companies and the affected parties.
Yep.
And we pioneered a process, it's just ridiculous, but of just going to talk to every one of them and finding out their assets and saying we're going to, if there's any movement involved here, first of all, you, the company, can reduce the movement by doing this, this, and this. So you have to know about mining. On the other hand, you have to know that I have 5 cabbages, 4 pear trees, and 17.2 square meters of building that I want replaced. as better, equal to or better than that. So I think it's just the combination of the conversation, anthropology of it, or along with the data is the key.
But if I may, just give me 2 seconds.
Here comes the anthropologist.
Well, just to respond, I think that, Deborah, what you were saying is that, yes, it's absolutely right that we do have a lot of conversation that's sort of divorced from, the design itself. But I think the conversation is not so much about the feelings or, the desires of the kind of house that people might want to live. But actually, John, I want to go back to those amazing Cree maps that you showed. And the kind of, basically the dream map that leads people to a place. And I think that's the process that we, that's the speculation that we are not yet seeing. So there's like endless sociological analysis and what have you, and the live work and etc. But in analyzing the codes that produce or allow that form to be transformed into something else, we are forgetting that there is a dream map also that's, probably very different from just having your, workplace next to you.
It's an amazing point to say that behind every state there's a Cree map.
No, I want to follow on that because I think one of the senses that we have in Los Angeles and definitely that I have as being a part of our recoding, which unfortunately is not a remapping. That's a whole other political minefield. But what I think is so frustrating is exactly what you said, is that the process and the inviting of the public in to talk about this is treated as an end in itself, and it is not being translated into anything that's going to be experienced on the ground. And I think there are going to be a lot of citizens who feel duped, basically.
Well, there's this adage, I think in the 1930s, that the map is not the territory, and to a certain extent, you're also saying that the code is not the city, or the code is not also the territory. Alex, Gazelle, is there anything you want to jump in with this? Or, is this a nice, I like these points in terms of both the fact that, the coding is not the same as the mapping, or too much coding, not enough mapping itself. And, there's clearly a rethinking of the agency of mapping, but also, the possibility of leaving off on the conversation that maybe we should be thinking in this era of rethinking state, that maybe there is a Cree map behind every state political map.
And even if that Cree map was produced by some colonial ethnographer. Let's not forget.
Well, also, but let's not forget also there was probably a voice of a Cree that then had to translate it to somebody
That's right,
who was drawing the map.
Cree, yeah.
And I think what I'm really, really excited about is the fact that this conversation, all of a sudden, also going around the room, has suddenly gone somewhat McLuhan-esque in terms of the fact that the question of media, not just map, but the question of media itself, technology, the public, the code, all of a sudden, if anything, perhaps we have too much information and we're not working in enough different media to actually really unlock that kind of potential.
Or we haven't found the level of abstraction to make sense of the amount of the information that we have.
Correct.
In this I wanted also to make the point, as far as cities have always been information-rich environments. It's not as though all of a sudden in the 2000s information appeared or data appeared as a sort of thing. Cities from the very beginning are the most rich, complex, adaptive systems of signals and boundaries and niche and the rest of this. And perhaps it's just we're beginning to figure out how to listen to it a little bit better and are a bit taken aback about how just we don't know how to hear it. We don't know what that level of abstraction is and able to make sense of it. And so I don't think where I would argue that the media, to a certain extent, do structure the possibility of what it's possible to say, and they are producing more information. It's not as though it wasn't already there.
Yeah, but I would say it is profound that the amount of information and the pace of information is so much faster just in the last 5 years.
But also,
it's changing the community politics so rapidly, and sometimes it's misinformation that's changing it.
Yeah, sure.
So that's the dilemma.
But it's one in which the decentralized versus decentralized dynamic is very complex, right? On the one hand, you've got everyone's got a supercomputer in their pocket, right, that's capable of 29 megabytes. You've got Google Earth, where you can see everything that sort of saves. So on the one hand, there's this massive distribution of 7 billion sensor mules across the planet, and yet it's all consolidated to a very small number of state-like central platforms.
Called
right?
Apple and Google.
Yes, and so to a certain extent, the kind of traditional logics of central, decentral that we might be used to thinking about spatial dynamics are a little bit complicated because they're both happening at the same time. And in fact, one is totally dependent on the other in ways in which older capitals, for example, didn't operate in that same way. It's not a same capital periphery dynamic at all.
I have a quick comment before I invite all of you to move over to Chow House and have lunch. While I was listening to you, it occurred to me that we might actually have more and more knowledge and technology and capacity to categorize knowledge, to map it in a finer and finer detail with the latest technologies that are way different from what Bobby described in his presentation. But what we might be missing is capacity to actually categorize the potential types of reaction to this knowledge that the citizens and governments and actually will express. Not just reactions, but forms of intervention, forms of ways of occupying lands, ways of building. And I think that's probably that wicked problem of planning lies in that it's not just the knowledge that we're missing, it's really apprehending, understanding how that knowledge will be used. And I hope that some of these questions will be tackled and answered in the second session. Pierre, thank you very much for moderating this.
Thank you very much for
thank you to the speakers. And